Hi, welcome. My name is John Buck. I have written a script titled The Antinatalist over the past year, and I'm just now getting a couple of people, some of my friends, to come and record the parts of the characters for the script. And so, yeah, I'm doing this now on the Bevry community channel. And yeah, okay. I'll just introduce each of you guys. You can say your name, your Twitter ad.
Introduce the script first, John.
Okay, yeah.
Give the listener reasons why they should listen and be enticed.
Good idea, Ben. All right. So yes, the script is titled The Antinatalist. It's about this professor who gets 5 random people and is attempting to persuade them over into the ethics of antinatalism. That is the ethic that it is immoral or unethical to procreate life or to have children. So yeah, that's the setting for the script. It's going to be just completely dialogue based, so it works perfectly for the audio medium. So yeah, and then each of you guys, you can introduce yourselves and the character that you'll be playing. I'll start with Katie.
Hi, I am Katie Yaw. I will be playing Lindsay. My Twitter is @GothLane.
Thank you. Yeah, and Ben?
Hey, I'm Ben playing John. My Twitter is BA Lupton, which is just Benjamin Arthur Lupton, my name.
All right, and Cody?
Hello, my name is CM Bradley. I will be playing Thomas, and my YouTube is CM Bradley.
All right, and SJ?
Hi, my name is SJ Thomason. I will be playing Ellen, and my Twitter handle is LEAD1225.
Thank you. And Phalanx?
Hi, I'm Phalanx. I just have a Twitter, just Phalanx. It's in the description. I don't want to spell it out.
Okay.
And I'm playing Bradley.
Thank you. And Jendrik?
Yeah, I'm Jendrik. I'm playing Samuel Carter, and my Twitter handle is @JEWE37.
Thank you. All right. So yeah, and just to forewarning, all of the views and opinions expressed by the characters in the script are in no way associated with the actual actors or actresses playing the characters. Just putting that out there.
I just want to make that really clear for me.
All right. Yeah, perfect. All right. And yeah. Oh, and also for anyone that's interested, they are perfectly welcome to mirror this onto their own YouTube channel or anything that they'd like. I'm perfectly fine with it going as far out there as possible, just so long as you have like the links and credited us appropriately in the description. That I'm perfectly fine with that. All right, and I think we're ready to start then. I'm going to open up the script. I don't have it open. I know, I'm sorry. And I'll just start sharing the screen for the script also, since. Oh yeah, and I should maybe introduce myself. My name is John Buck, and I'm only going to be playing the narrator for the script here. All right. Oh boy. Share screen. All right. All right. Yes. And can I move that? All right. Here we go. The Antinatalist, written by John Buck. Exterior, small church parking lot, day. A woman in nurse's scrubs, Ellen, 36, sits inside her older, rundown car. She sighs, removes the keys, grabs her purse, and exits. Interior, church entrance. 3 men, standing and drinking coffee, look over at her as she enters, then return to their conversation. She quickly moves past them and takes a seat near the pulpit of the church. John, 24, a lanky young man in glasses, continues.
Yeah, I mustn't have stepped in a church in. Must be 13 years. Hopefully God doesn't smite me for being an atheist.
Thomas, 31, a bit rounder of a man, nods, holding his bagel in a napkin.
Yeah, that'd be a shame.
John furrows his brow while Thomas takes a bite. Bradley, 26, with sunken-in eyes and longer blonde hair, quietly sips his coffee, disengaged from their conversation.
Any idea what this whole thing's supposed to be about? All I got was a random invite on Facebook that said $50 for 3 hours. How much you want to bet it's not going to be so straightforward?
I'm guessing it's some sort of timeshare scam. I've been to a couple of these. You just have to hold on, Feign the smallest amount of interest, but don't give them an inch.
A blue Prius parks outside, and both of them watch as Lindsay, 28, an attractive brunette, exits and approaches.
Maybe it won't be as bad as we thought.
He sets down his coffee as she enters and outstretches his hand.
Hello there, I'm John.
Hi, I'm Lindsay.
I'm Thomas. Lindsay? That's also my mother's name, or was.
Oh, sorry for your loss.
He nods his thanks. She offers a hand to Bradley, who rolls his eyes and drinks his coffee. She lowers it, confused.
So what do you do, Lindsay?
Oh, I'm a yoga instructor.
Oh, maybe I could stop by sometime. I could use a break from working on computers all day.
Yeah, I can.
I'm a biologist, so I stay pretty active going to places all around the globe. Just got back from Guatemala, actually.
Oh, that's really cool, Thomas.
John looks at him and blinks. Interior, pulpit. Samuel Carter, 47, with dark curly hair and a casual suit, is configuring a laptop connected to a projector. He looks over at the several people that have arrived, checks his watch, and looks dismayed. Shaking his head, he taps the microphone in front of him.
Test. Great. If you could all please come sit. I'll be starting shortly. Oh, and if you could just please sit up a little bit closer. I don't think anyone else will be joining us today, and I don't want to feel like I'm preaching at all of you.
They comply and sit in the first 2 rows.
Thank you. Now, thank you all for coming. Now, for you all to receive the money afterwards,
He holds up the envelopes.
I'm going to need each of your phones until we are finished.
They look confused and start to object.
I recognize the inconvenience, but you're each being paid here for your time. This is a restriction on how you're allowed to spend it. I'm going to be requiring your full attention for this.
He pulls out a basket and approaches each of them.
They'll be close by, so if there is any emergency, you can access them, but please put them on silent so that we may begin.
They each place in their smartphones. Bradley, a flip phone. Thomas smirks and turns towards him.
You seriously have a...
He notices that Bradley is concealed carrying a pistol on his hip. Thomas goes stone-faced and turns back to the pulpit. Samuel returns to the podium and places the basket of phones on the inner shelf. Thomas glances back at the door, half worriedly, and tries to calm himself down. Presentation.
All right, now we can start. Thank you all for coming. It'll be small today, but that's all right. I guess I'll just get right into it. My name is Samuel Carter. I am here today to raise and discuss a very important question with all of you.
He takes a breath.
Perhaps the most important question we could ask. Should life be allowed to continue?
A few surprised reactions from the audience.
I'm here today to present the case that it should not. That to bring about new life into this world would be an unnecessary act, only leading to the inevitable suffering for that individual, and thus it is wrong. I'm here to present the case that we have a moral obligation to not have children.
In the silence, oh yeah. Thomas partially chuckles.
I've titled my presentation "The Case Against Existence," and I'll have a long Q&A directly following it so that we can work this all out between us. All right, here we go.
He starts his PowerPoint. On screen, a video plays of baby sea turtles crawling out from their eggshells buried in the sand. Over 100 or so crawling all over each other through the sandy beach. The hatchlings all crawl towards the ocean. Up above are seagulls, suddenly swooping down. The seagulls peck and pull at the baby turtles' heads, fighting between each other, tearing flippers from off the turtles, flipping the turtles onto their backs so they are unable to escape. Lindsay covers her mouth. The rest watch quietly. On screen, the young turtles quickly waddle towards the ocean, but several hawks swoop down also and carry some of them off. On screen, a hermit crab approaches one of them and pulls on the turtle's flippers, others approaching and attacking its eyes, pulling them out of socket. On screen, finally, of the 100 plus young sea turtles that started out, only 3 of them have made it all the way to the ocean. Text reads, on average, only 1/1000th of the survived hatchlings that actually make it past the beach ever fully reach adulthood once inside the ocean. The video finishes and each of them slump into their seats, Lindsay looking nauseous, holding her stomach.
I'm only using sea turtles here as a direct example of the fundamental nature to life on Earth. While not all other species share in the near immediate death toll from their first moments of existence, there is the shared commonality that all animals, including us, hold unambiguously, that we all do and shall inevitably experience both pain and death. These two unconditional facts can never be denied. Sea turtles are not some outlier of evolution. They've emerged around the same time of the extinction of the dinosaurs 65 million years ago. This messy process we see here is what is considered a successful biological strategy for them.
On screen, a slideshow of photos throughout history of battles, destruction, wounded soldiers, piles of naked corpses, starving African children made of only skin and bones, the slaughter of live cows swinging upside down by their back legs, young chicks moved along a conveyor belt into a meat grinder to be eviscerated alive, etc.
There are the horrifying facts of nature that modern people seem to have either entirely forgotten or are willfully ignoring. These facts of death and suffering. Most every creature that has ever lived desires to continue living, a wish that will always go unfulfilled. This desire is built into a biology because those that didn't want to live didn't and did not pass on their genes. The death avoidance instinct is hardwired into all of us, but death is something that is always going to happen, and it has happened to every single person and animal that has ever lived. And to make things worse, prior to death, a great deal of suffering was experienced by them. People are born with incurable chronic illnesses and have to live in constant pain. Children are born with horrible diseases, only to die before their 5th birthdays. And why? Why do we allow this to continue?
He looks over his audience. Ellen, the nurse in scrubs, is staring down at the floor. The youngest, John, is writing notes into the back page of a Bible in front of him. Thomas is seemingly unimpressed with his arms crossed. Lindsay is looking forward and touching her hair. Bradley stares blankly forward, no emotion visible, as if he hadn't heard a thing. Samuel changes the slide to a 4-square chart with existence titled over the left side and non-existence on the right. The top 2 squares read pain and the bottom 2 say pleasure.
But I'm not here to make arguments against nature. Instead, I'm directing my attention towards those that can actually do something about this problem. We humans have the ability to recognize good and bad situations for ourselves and others. And with this comes the responsibility to act upon this knowledge.
Sorry. He points to the left side of the chart.
Here's my most basic argument. 1. For those that exist, the presence and experience of pain is a negative. 2. The presence and experience of pleasure is a positive.
Pointing to the right half.
The removal or avoidance of pain is a positive, even if there is no one to be able to appreciate it. And 4, the absence of pleasure is not a negative unless it is taken from someone who already exists. This is what I call the asymmetry dilemma, that by existing, we experience negative states as well as positive ones. But for those who do not exist, they aren't deprived from any positive states, yet do not have to experience any negative ones. So, then it is objectively better to not come to exist.
He pauses, making eye contact with each of them.
Better to have never come into existence.
Samuel sighs, the tension and gravity loosening.
I apologize for just laying it all out like this up front. I'd now like to clarify some of my points, go over any exceptions and objections to these premises, so that you all have a basic understanding of the reasoning behind the argument.
He changes the slide, showing an animated hand touching a hot stove and immediately reacting to it.
So, pain is bad. Usually this premise doesn't get much objection until the obvious conclusion is revealed. So I'd like to directly contend with the common objections I usually get before we move on. My evidence to support this can be exemplified through the act of touching a hot stove. It is simply a fact that we have a negative subjective response to any action that inflicts pain upon us, and we naturally try to avoid those whenever possible.
He changes the slide again to show a woman running on a treadmill.
Of course, not all pain is to be considered wholly bad. There are certain amounts of pain that are voluntarily accepted so as to fulfill something subjectively considered good, such as the pain that one might get from exercise for the good of one's health. These are times where inflicting a negative experience upon yourself could and would be justified by yourself, because it is used towards an overall more positive goal in the service of well-being. I recognize this, but would like to point out how it does nothing to counter my argument, because that pain would still be associated with a negative experience. It's just that a person's goals override their avoidance of pain so as to meet their other biologically driven desires.
He takes a drink from his water bottle.
It is important to note that when I say that the experience of pleasure is good, that is not to say that all that brings pleasure can be necessarily called good. For there are actions that bring pleasure to certain people while causing harm to others. One example would be the sexual molestation of a child by persons in authority. This is an obvious bad, dare I say even an evil, but it still most likely brings about some amount of pleasure to the molester and possibly even momentarily for the victim. But because there are greater amounts of suffering that arise from such actions, we know them to be obviously reprehensible and thus still wrong, despite perhaps being pleasurable to the subjects.
He wipes his brow.
The reason I say that the avoidance of pain is good, we can think about how if someone is suffering from sickness and we were to make that person well, that would be a good, just by keeping their suffering from occurring further. Or if we were to keep someone from ever becoming sick from a disease in the first place, that would also be a good, such as with vaccines or modern medicine.
His next slide reads scientific moral realism.
Now, I am not a moral relativist. There can be factual discoveries to be made of how the human brain produces positive and negative subjective feelings. I consider myself a moral realist, meaning that moral questions can and do have objective answers regarding the experience of conscious creatures. Rather than grounding morality into an external reality as with Platonism or Christianity,
he casually motions to the church around him.
I hold that the reality of moral values are located within the subjects themselves.
Pointing to his head.
Good and bad are real, insofar as they are minds that are real, capable of evaluating and differentiating their experiences as either negative or positives. Belief, simply put, that whatever it is we call morally good refers to the maximization of well-being for existing subjective creatures, without causing suffering as a cost to other subjective creatures that do or shall come to exist. For these reasons, I do consider myself an antinatalist, someone who agrees with the philosophy of antinatalism, which assigns a negative moral weight to the act of procreation.
He sighs and checks his watch.
All right. I'll start the Q&A in a few minutes, so I'll try to rush through the rest of this. If we need to, we can go back through any of it later on.
He takes another drink and wipes his mouth.
Now, when I said that it would be better to have never come into existence, I recognized that there would be no actual subject prior to the creation that would be directly benefited by not existing. For those that do not exist have no mind either to experience positive or negative states. I'm rather looking at it objectively to recognize that if a subject were to be created, they would inevitably experience suffering and have negative experiences. So it would be better in the sense that it avoids negative subjective states for that individual that they would have if they were to exist.
His next slide reads ethical obligations.
Now that you all understand that there is inevitable harm that is only brought about towards those that come into existence, we must ask ourselves the important question, do we then have an ethical obligation to not bring about new life? I believe the obvious answer is yes. Those that might disagree would likely say that maybe the needless harms from coming into existence are justified somehow, and it's still worth it for some reason. I disagree, but still, what are the typical reasons that they might give?
He reads the next slide.
For the child's own sake, for their parents' sake, for humanity at large's sake. I believe that none of these objections really work and shall go into each directly.
The first point on screen boldens. Oh.
For the child's own sake. This might partially be a misunderstanding of the Kantian maxim, treat every person as an end unto themselves, and not simply as a means to an end. And, as I agree with this maxim, it should be properly understood. The reason a person is an end unto themselves is because they already exist and are capable of experiencing suffering and pleasure in their lives. If we are to consider an unborn potential human, we can make calculations for their potential futures as we might as for those that are in comas. Then, Using the asymmetry argument, it is clear that if we are acting on the potential humans' behalf, it would be better for them to not come into existence. Just for an exaggerated example, consider that you have the knowledge that a child, if it were to be born, would have a severe illness, a short, painful, and hard life. They are to die before even their second birthday. Now, why should that child be forced by negligent parents to come into existence, just so as to experience that pain and suffering? I think it is fairly obvious that there is a duty we have to not allow that child to undergo such needless hardships, and that it must be kept from ever being born into such suffering. So, if we accept that, why would we allow other potential children that will surely face other ranges and varieties of pain and suffering during their lives to have been be born? The only difference between the situations is in scale, not in any differentiating properties.
He boldens the second point.
For the sake of the parents, if we treat all people as ends unto themselves, then we must also consider the happiness and meaning that the potential parents might gain from having children. Now, we already know from the pedophile example used earlier that merely because someone might desire an end, that does not make that a good. We must always consider the costs, but nonetheless, the prospective parents might still desire a child. For them, there is always the option to adopt or raise foster children. This would promote the positive experiences for those parents, as well as for those that already exist inside of bad circumstances, instead of neglecting them while creating new life to face inevitable suffering.
He pauses, scanning his audience. Ellen is looking away from him, looking upon a hanging crucifix to her left. John is staring intently back at Samuel, leg bobbing with energy. Thomas is casually sitting with chin in hand. Lindsay looks down at the ground, almost comatose in thought, and Bradley is completely unfazed. Samuel Carter continues.
And what of for the good of humanity? There are three definitions that are usually attempting to be expressed by this objection. So I shall divide them in equivocated terms and deal with them each definition accordingly. Humanity of the past. Our ancestors had desires for what they would like to be done after their passing, and we respect the wishes of the dead in dealing with their bodies as they would have wanted while they were still alive. However, we do not always respect the wishes of the dead, such as where those wishes held by those that came before us were based upon false assumptions or come in conflict with our current values. Say, if a bigot from the past might have thought black people were intrinsically inferior to white people from the cultural propaganda and ignorance of the time, and wished their future bloodlines to be only pure Caucasian, their offspring that exists presently have no reason to honor that wish, and may of course have relationships with those of whoever they like. Same for the statues of ancient gods. While we might respect the artists and appreciate their craftsmanship, we no longer use the statue in their original purpose, to be worshipped, because we no longer believe those gods to be real. In sum, the people of the past had false beliefs regarding reality. We are not required to continue to hold ourselves to the ancient values that they held.
He changes slides.
Humanity of the present. These are the people that are currently alive and have the potential to experience both pain and suffering. There is the intriguing argument for bringing children into existence that, if by their coming into existence a greater amount of suffering can be mitigated, then we should do so. Now, I believe this argument could possibly have been made within the context of our history, since for the agricultural societies of the past, having more children meant that you had more workers so that the already existing family wouldn't starve. But now, through the efforts of all our past generations, we've collectively developed as a human race such a large amount of control over our environment that and now can interact with every other person on the globe. We now have the capacity to speak, convince, and enforce other peoples and nations to hold universal ethics. No longer, if it ever was necessary, do we new sentient beings need to come into existence to provide resources for us.
Next slide.
And humanity of the future. Now, if we were it were likely that generations were still definitely going to continue, or if our lifespans were much longer than they are now, we would have the moral obligations to build a future that would benefit us as best we can. But if we finally arrive to a point where the majority of people accept the voluntary extinction of the human race as an ultimate good, then no such future people need to be morally considered, for they would not even come to exist. So I believe the objection, "we have children for humanity's sake," is able to be rebutted on all three counts.
He finishes the bottle of water.
Thus, it seems obvious to me that for anyone made aware of the harm they would cause by bringing a child into existence, and yet still commit to doing so, they are either acting in selfishness, maliciously, or with a disregard to the facts. They have no moral, no rational justification for their actions. And I believe that we all instead have an obligation to not create life.
Ellen quietly rubs her eyes. Objections.
Thus concludes my initial presentation. I'd now like to start with the Q&A session, where each of you can work through any misunderstandings or objections that you have with my talk, so that hopefully we can work through them all together and reach some sort of shared conclusion. I'd like each of you to introduce yourself and your primary takeaways or alternate points to today's lecture, and then I'll respond to each in turn.
He motions to Ellen, who stands up gingerly.
Hi, I'm Ellen. I'm actually a Christian, so I guess my main disagreement with you is I don't think that you can just define morality down to say that whatever is painful is just bad. I think we have certain obligations given to us by God, such as the commandment to be fruitful and multiply. Also, I think that pain can sometimes be used by God to tell us what we're doing is wrong. So that doesn't exactly make pain itself bad, but God might be punishing us for not obeying him, like with Jonah. And pain is his only way of guiding us back towards him in a way that we'd actually listen to.
Samuel makes an appreciative smile and nods, then motions for Thomas to speak.
Okay, well, I'm Thomas. I'm not a Christian, but I see how the modern Western values I do hold are byproducts of our religious history. I think that you're misguided as to what morality and well-being are. Our moral senses have evolved just for fostering group cooperation. The evolutionary psychologist Jonathan Haidt actually lays out from his research 5 primary moral intuitions that we perceive the world through, each serving an evolutionary purpose. It seems like care and harm are the only ones that you are using for your argument, which is a very liberal sensibility, by the way. But there are others, such as liberty, fairness, loyalty, authority, and sanctity, which is a primarily religious moral foundation. Merely using the avoidance of pain, as you are, is a very simplistic and naive way to track well-being, because people can actually be happy while enduring bitter winters if they are with their family. Or, in reverse, they can be severely depressed by themselves living inside of a 5-star hotel in Malibu. People find the meaning that enables them to endure suffering by living for and amongst others.
As he sits down, John immediately stands.
No. That's completely wrong.
I'm going to have to ask you to direct all your arguments towards me specifically. If you disagree with someone else, you may explain why during your case against my position.
John shrugs and turns to Samuel.
Fine. I disagree with both of them on morality. It is neither forced upon us by some invisible God, nor programmed into us through evolution, just for group-based sacrifices. It's instead achieved only through the use of reason and rationality by the individual for discovering what they are best, for discovering what are the best courses of actions that they can take in achieving their own self-interest. Now, my biological reality certainly plays a part, since I need to eat food in order to stay alive. And if I eat things that I'm allergic to, this would certainly endanger my health. But the only interests I can be certain of are my own. And the only thing that you can control is yourself, making it the only thing that you are responsible for. To live under the values of others is a form of lying, slavery, and theft. We are only obligated to act towards others, insofar as we agree with and accept this obligation. Now, I'm not some sort of anarchist. My personal self-interest might be best manifested through cooperation with others, such as through the free market, where I can trade money to someone more experienced than myself for such things as vehicle maintenance, where one sells his time and expertise at a rate he's comfortable with myself accepting that price if I consider the offer more valuable than not accepting it. That way, we both benefit from this consensual exchange. It's a win-win. This is why I'm an objectivist.
He smugly smiles at Carter, who remains silent, then looks over to Lindsay.
Okay. I'm John, by the way.
Lindsay stalls, thinking.
Okay. I'm Lindsay, and I suppose that my disagreement is that I don't think there's such a thing as a universal morality. For instance, the early Europeans thought that they were right and everyone else was wrong, and that's just what they used as justification for conquering the peoples that they called backwards and savages. The Native Americans had their own sets of customs and practices that worked for them. And then we just took their land away from them and forced them to comply with our ideas of what a good society should be. There may be some that agree that it's wrong to have kids, and others that find that having children is the most fulfilling thing that they can do. Everyone's experience is different, and so it's wrong to try to overlay universal standard onto everyone for them to have to conform to. Belief in an objective morality is something that limits us and divides us. Rather, there's a source of infinite goodness, love, and beauty in the universe that we are all connected to and can draw from by accepting it. That's it.
She sits down. They all turn to look at Bradley, sitting in the back. He doesn't bother to stand. He sighs.
I'm Bradley Fisher, and surprisingly enough, I disagree with all of you. Morality, specifically Christian morality, is an invention used by the weak to socially demolish the strong, and used to justify themselves in their avoidance of attempting anything difficult or frightening. There's no such thing as morality because there's no such thing as free will. All that we can ever truly speak about is what our instincts cause us to do and to not do. Sure, we might feel like there are actions that we should do, but it's meaningless to discuss them without including what it is that we can do and what we will do. There is only that which makes me act and which cannot make me act. Death being one such prime force, the morality of the herd being another. So your attempt to force your rules upon me has failed because I do not admire nor seek to emulate you, nor are you in any position of power to enforce your asinine rules onto me.
Samuel's eyebrows go up, surprised, and he even lets out a small chuckle. But he smiles and nods his thanks to Bradley. Moral realism.
Wow. Well, thank you all. I'd now like to discuss each of your points so that hopefully we can all come to some sort of consensus. I know that might sound impossible, but so long as we do not interrupt each other and focus only on each of the specific arguments made, I really think that we can reach a shared understanding and hopefully a conclusion. Now, after I finish responding to each person, if any of you have further points regarding that particular topic, we can go into those before I move on to the next person's objections. Let's just try to keep this orderly, please.
He locks eyes with Ellen and smiles.
Now, Ellen, right? I'm Samuel. I want to just be sure that I have your points correctly. Your position is that pain is not actually a universal bad in and of itself, but can be used by God to direct us away from evil actions and more towards them, I suppose? And that God has given us commands for us to follow, presumably to also aid us in following after him. One of those commands being to create offspring. Is all that correct?
Yeah, I'd say so. Also, I'd say that since God knows everything, he has greater knowledge than we can ever have on what is right and wrong for what we should do. Him knowing all the possible outcomes for all things and directing our paths towards the best possible world, even if it's not the best from our own limited perspectives.
Samuel considers this additional point and is about to respond.
See, none of us actually own ourselves, but we are all children of God's. And as his possessions, he has full authority for how to use us as he sees fit, Life is given to us and it can be taken away. Nothing we have has been earned or created of ourselves. All relies on God's grace in allowing us to experience it.
All right. I do have to say I'm somewhat surprised by your argument actually, since it seems to carry the same premises used by slave owners in the past. That the people classified as property have no say over how they should act or be treated. Can you see how those comparisons can be made?
The difference, though, is that humans cannot own other humans because they did not create themselves or others, nor sustain all of existence, which we all live within. We give ourselves up to God's use in submission to his greater knowledge and power.
Even still, I don't like the form of the argument that merely because someone created a being, that gives them the right to rule over that person. Especially considering those created can have conscious experiences that are positive and negative that will happen regardless of the intentions of their creator. Do you mind if I ask from which particular sect of Christianity you are?
Yeah, I'm Catholic.
I see, that's very helpful. Now, while I myself am not a theist, I do not believe that my position of antinatalism can only be had by atheists and agnostics. Many of the characters of the Bible, in fact, have remarked upon the futility of life and show regret for being born. Even God himself in the stories, such as soon after commanding the humans to be fruitful and multiply, he expresses regret at creating them and destroys all but one family in a great flood. Also, as you are a Christian, all those previous commandments that were given would have been superseded by Jesus, who replaced them with just two: to love God and to love our neighbors as ourselves. Now, I should point out that neither of those require procreation. In fact, I'd say the holiest men within religious history have all been celibate. Jesus himself, as well as most of the saints. Paul even going so far as to advocate against marriage to the Corinthians. Jesus himself had made an antagonistic statement regarding Judas in Matthew, that it would have been better for him if he had not been born.
That's all just your atheistic interpretations of scripture, which is already invalid because you don't believe in God. So why are you even using it to try to support your case?
I can still assume that the Bible was written by men attempting to be moral and doing the best with what they had at the time. And I'm not using any type of alternative interpretations of scripture to make my points. I'm only using the commonly accepted understanding from the scholars in their fields. There's no reason to be upset, Ellen. The only disagreement you and I have is over God's existence.
that makes all the difference. If there's no God, then that means there's no objective morality, no afterlife, no good or bad, no meaning, nothing. But if objective morality does exist, then that requires an objective lawgiver.
Why?
Because for something to be objectively moral, that means that there is a way in which something should be used, even if it can be used in other ways. For instance, a shovel. That has a purpose built into its existence by its creator. It's to be used to dig with. I could use the shovel in other ways, say to murder someone with it, but that's not what the tool was built for. If there is an objective morality, it means that we people also have certain ways in which we should live, some purpose that we each were created for, and that also means that there is an intelligent creator that designed us for that purpose. Say I found a pocket watch along a road. You wouldn't say that the watch had no purpose behind it because it's obvious that it does have a purpose, what's known as telos. Its end goal is to tell time with. Even if the clock is incorrect or has stopped working, the design and purpose is part of the machine. And so too for us. Your morality entirely leaves out all purpose for why people live in the first place, and also for why they ought to live. Thus it fails, because people need reasons for why they should do certain things over others. Otherwise, they'd be acting irrationally and not in line with an objective reality.
I see. The confusion is how we are each differently using the word morality. When I say words like should, I'm using it similarly to how I'd say, oh, you're headed to California? You should take I-40. I'm not forcefully using my authority over you to tell you how you must act, but instead I'm pointing out how, since you have a certain ethic you live according to, there are certain changes to your actions that you should adopt in order to better meet that ethical standard. For instance, I actually do think that natural selection has built into us certain drives, a telos if you want, but I do not consider the purpose of these drives to be all morally good. In fact, I believe them to be quite immoral and selfish in nature, since only the most selfish organisms are the ones that survive. Evolution itself is constantly breeding the most immoral of creatures, even by our own standards. So, in order to more closely meet our ethical standard, we ought to reject the innate drives bred into us via evolution.
Wait, so you think that evolution is immoral, but also as an atheist, that means that you think that we are merely the byproducts of unguided evolution. So how do you reach your conclusion that your ideas of morality are correct, since they go against evolution? Seems like you have a contradiction there. In order to even say that something is wrong, you've already accepted the Christian framework of there being a moral reality transcendent to our evolved biological structures, something not arrived at by natural means. And if there are moral facts and obligations out there, then that means that there's a rational and transcendent moral arbiter for these terms.
I believe that that's actually a non sequitur, Ellen, and doesn't logically follow. I don't believe that my morality is derived merely from an evolutionary process, nor that it is imposed by some sort of moral dictator onto me. I can reach the conclusion that 2 + 2 = 4 through deductive reasoning, simply by understanding the nature of 2 and the results that come from adding it onto itself to make 4. I may have derived the brain capable of this ability through evolutionary history, but the practice of mathematics is only evolutionarily successful under certain circumstances, not always what nature will reward. Moral reasoning is just as similar a practice as mathematics, not some commands given by God or an authority figure to me.
He raises his eyebrows.
In fact, if objective morality exists, then that means that God does not.
What? How so?
Well, let's actually consider what it means that there are objective moral facts or obligations. Declarations about what ought and what ought not to occur within reality. What should and should not be, but yet still are. Components to reality that should not exist. For instance, the true statement, rape is wrong, means that any time rape actually occurs within reality, that it is in breach of that moral fact. A wrong has been committed within our reality, going against the moral order. Now, if these moral facts are grounded in God as part of his nature, and since God cannot do anything outside of his own nature, then that would mean that God could not have created a universe in which the violation of moral facts could occur. And since we exist in a universe where such moral breaches do occur all the time, this is an indication that this universe could not have been created by a being whose moral nature was consistent with his actions. This is why many Platonists and Christian philosophers who believed in objective morality became Gnostics, believing that this world was actually created by an evil god, the demiurge, that the god only ever exists within the immaterial realm and is not to be found from anywhere here on Earth.
Well, okay. Maybe these moral facts only apply to those with free will. Since if by rape you just mean non-consensual sex, then technically my dog could be considered a rapist to my husband's leg. But because animals are unaware of the consequences to their actions, different from how we humans are, they cannot be morally blamed for acting according to their biology. So God wouldn't be in the wrong for creating the universe. Only we, moral agents with free will, would be in the wrong for going against what was set out specifically for us.
No, I disagree that simply because a being is unaware of the consequences to their actions, that what they did was not wrong. That actually sounds more like a moral subjectivist argument. A mentally retarded man might be acting according to his biological drives to have sex with a young girl, unaware or uncaring of the long-term psychological consequences that abuse would have on her. But his actions would still be wrong, not because of his intentionality or any volition that he might have had, but rather because of the negative results to his behavior. This is also why I think the God hypothesis to objective morality doesn't work. Because if God is outside of time and knows all consequences to our actions, and yet still creates us with imperfect knowledge, causing us to go against his will, then he would be in the wrong for creating us. If God intentionally created us, knowing that we do actions that are evil, then he himself would be evil for creating us. Just like if I were to train a dog to kill babies up on sight, I'd have bred a creature whose telos was not to cause suffering. The
What's
dog
to
doesn't.
cause suffering?
What?
Just retake that line, sorry.
I'd have bred a creature whose telos was to cause suffering. The dog doesn't know any better, but I myself do, and I would be the immoral one. If man has free will, as Christianity says, then I'd have to imagine that we've turned so far away from what intention God might have had for us, and we have been continually breeding or later generations to just be sadistic hedonists that do not care about how much harm they might cause to others, unless they themselves are harmed by it as well.
But that still doesn't take into account what I said about us misusing our telos. If I made a kitchen knife for chopping vegetables and someone uses that knife to murder with, that's an incorrect usage of the knife. I'm not morally responsible for them using my knife in a way that I didn't intend.
Except a primary trait of the classical God is that it's omniscient. So any maluse of its intended creations would be seen and known by him before the fact. Yet the murderous psychopath was still created by God, knowing full well that he would go against his divine will anyways. This just means that God would, and does, prefer that mankind has the freedom and capacity to do evil things over his preference that children are not sexually abused, or that any other evil does not occur.
But you still face the problem of having no basis for why certain actions are objectively immoral if there is no God, because then your sense of this thing is wrong is just your opinion.
That's a change in subject, Alan. And it's not opinion. It's an accurate reading of the negative subjective states we experience in response to certain causes. You can pretend to doubt all moral claims, but you cannot deny that the experiencing of pain against your will is a negative. The two are synonymous. From there, all my other positions are built up. I believe that you accept the starting premise, just that you are unwilling to consider the logical implications of it.
He looks at each of them.
There's a contradiction between the nature of our internal moral senses and the external environment that we find ourselves in. This contradiction brings forth anguish and suffering to us as subjects. We exist within a reality which plays out differently from what we can bear calling all good, meaning that one of us will have to budge. Mankind cannot give up his moral senses, and reality cannot fully correspond in favor with each of all our specific individualistic and contradictory desires, meaning that for us to remove suffering from the world, we must cease to exist. But I would still like to return to your original points, Alan. You're Catholic, so you believe in hell, right?
Yes. I believe that people's choices during this life, either towards God or away from him, have ramifications for the state of where their eternal soul shall exist after they die.
Okay, so does God desire for people to go to hell?
I think that the answer is no, but I'm not really an expert on all this stuff. You'd really have to talk to my priest.
You're doing just fine, Alan. I just want to talk with you at whatever level you're comfortable with.
Thanks. So yeah, God wills for all of us to come to him, but some of us reject him and are doomed to torment in hell for this choice.
If God does not will that any should perish, but rather that all should come to repentance, as it says in 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 9, then what does that tell us when we see that there are those that do not come to repentance and ultimately perish? It seems clear to me that God is either not all-powerful and wills for things he cannot have, or that he does not actually will for all to come to him, and he is not all loving, which would make the scripture untrue.
Huh? Maybe God subordinates his own will to ours. That it is his will that we all come to him, only of our own volition, and not by any means of coercion.
Then why create hell? That seems to be the greatest coercive move of all of them. Obey me and be blessed, or disobey me and be destroyed. Obviously, God doesn't seem afraid of using coercive means to get his way. Just look to the hardening of the Pharaoh's heart in Exodus for an example. Because we all are creatures of physical natures with desires and needs, we can never make any volitional choices free from coercion. The universe we inhabit is not conducive to our survival and thriving. As Jesus said, the poor shall always be with us. This is, to me, an indication that there is an eternal flow within existence itself, meaning that the creator is limited, evil, or non-existent.
Ellen is quiet, uncertain of how to respond. Consequentialism.
Now, I would actually like to move on to the others, so I'll get back to you later. Okay, Ellen?
He turns to Thomas.
Let me see if I can recall your point correctly. You believe that we have evolved a sense of morality for cooperating within groups? Is that correct?
Sort of. I'm a biologist, but I'm not making any sort of group selectionist type of argument. I'm not saying that humans have adapted traits that are for the good of the group instead of themselves. I'm instead saying that during our history, it has been to the genetic advantage of the individual to coordinate themselves within groups, and that our moral sensibilities have developed for that purpose.
Okay, just to clarify, when you say that for that purpose, you're not...
No, I'm not making any sort of intelligent design argument. Evolution has no intentionality behind it. It is a blind process. But through that blind process, intelligent solutions to problems can and are developed, our moral sensibilities being one such example.
Okay, so what you've put forward here is what's known as descriptive ethics. It just means that you're describing how we've come to have our current ethics and morals, nothing about whether we should continue using our instinctive moral senses or not. I can agree with you that our moral senses are likely evolutionarily derived, probably for the very reasons in the past that you specified. But I, as all of us, am no longer using just my instincts for interacting with the world. I'm also using my rational faculties, because the environment we find ourselves in today is almost entirely different from that which we've originally evolved to inhabit.
He starts to talk down to him.
If I did currently think that genetic propagation was the most important thing I could be doing with my time, as evolution would tell us, I'd simply spend all of my time donating semen to IVF clinics. But I don't do that. Do you know why? Because, to put it bluntly, Thomas, I think the blind goals that evolution has embedded within us are kind of stupid. I'm not at all particularly interested in what an unconscious genetic replicator might have to add to this conversation. Now, you might be aware that evolution has not given us an innate sense of numbers. Many tribes have developed with only very basic forms of counting. They only have words for 1, 2, 3, and then they just have a word for many. So, just as we have, through culture and education, built up mathematics for more very basic intuitions, I am doing the same thing with morality. Pain hurts is all I need to build up a system of rational morality. Group and tribal loyalties might have been the best practice for our survival in the past, but to argue for it today is to make the naturalistic fallacy. In fact, I actually believe that people's intrinsic tribalistic natures is probably one of the greatest problems we have for us living in today's modern world.
What is it that you mean by the naturalistic fallacy?
To point towards something occurring within nature as justification for why it ought to continue. Such as, look at the ducks. They rape their females, sometimes even to death. Therefore, we ought to decriminalize gang rape in humans as well, because it's been proven to be an evolutionarily successful strategy for males to employ. That would be the naturalistic fallacy.
Okay, obviously I disavow rape. Come on. But referring only to your original accusation, if pointing to nature to justify moral claims is supposed to be a fallacy, it's one that we are always making and can't ever escape having to make since we don't have access to anything outside of nature. It would only be a valid fallacy if you accept the implicit assumption made by the religious that our morality is not derived through natural means. But I'm a naturalist, so of course I think that our morality is derived entirely by nature. I think the burden of proof would lay I think the burden of proof would have to lay on you for arguing why our morality is somehow non-naturally derived and that such things even exist. Which I suppose would mean that you'd be arguing for some sort of divine intervention, implanting within us our moral senses, as well as having to prove that they weren't instead derived through living in tribes over the course of over 400,000 years. Regardless of all that, I'm actually not even making the naturalistic fallacy. I'm not saying that we ought to listen to our institution, that I'm not saying that we ought to listen to our intuition simply because they are there. Sorry. I'm not saying that we ought to listen to our intuition simply because they are there. I'm saying that the reason they're there in the first place is because they must have been effective when put into practice in our past, or else they would not be passed down to us. That is why we ought to consider them. If these instincts were not effective at attaining our ancestors' goals, we would not still see them within us today. And since we still share most of the same biological needs of our ancestors, we ought not to disregard our innate moral sensibilities just because they do not currently adhere with your own invented and untested ideology. Everything that we might ever call good is just stating that it is conforming to our expectations and working towards our biological goals. Unless you're postulating some sort of metaphysical moral reality in which goodness is only attained by certain actions and intentions, regardless of the positive and negative consequences towards our goals, which I don't think you have been. So your pointing out of the naturalistic fallacy doesn't actually make sense.
I see. So you're a consequentialist then. For you, the ends justify the means.
I'm saying that reality is a consequentialist. Evolution is consequentialism. I myself am a pragmatist. If a principle doesn't work in practice, it's not worth adopting.
See, I'm calling into question the very validity behind our biological goals. Those goal sets have only been gained through whatever moral or immoral practice that happened to reproduce its genes. The very reason we adopt principles and ethics in the first place is to change our environment, structures not to conform to the ones that are already there. Rape is actually quite common among mammals, so we've had to create laws and punishments in order to make rape illegal and taboo. What originally meant by my accusation is that there's an unseen assumption being made by yourself that whatever's evolutionarily beneficial is in fact good to do. That's how you're committing the naturalistic fallacy. You're using a circular tautology. Whatever we are evolved to is considered moral, because only the moralities of those that survived got passed on. This would only be acceptable if you also held that the universe we exist within was created by a benevolent deity that rewarded only the moral and punished only the immoral. But I think that this is obviously not the case. Perhaps even the opposite is true. The universe is uncaring of all that suffering that occurs within it. As I see it, the blind forces of nature have caused us to desire the wrong types of things, just because these desires were effective at gene spreading. For instance, Genghis Khan, with all his raping and pillaging, was the most evolutionarily successful person that might have ever lived. Estimated that 0.5% of all men on Earth today are directly genetically related to him. That right there is your evolutionary morality for you. But I'm sure you as well, are not actually advocating that we take a page out of the Mongol playbook for morality, which means that you're not actually accepting the evolution's ideas of morality.
He becomes deadly serious.
What pragmatism means is that if Hitler were a more competent leader, Nazism would be the correct morality of the 20th century, since whatever survives is morally correct. And I adamantly disagree. We cannot simply use this success of an act to prove its validity, because we cannot actually communicate with the future until after it's already too late. Your methodology means that whatever we do that allows us to survive automatically becomes right. Pragmatism means that to die for what one believes in is foolish and wrong thing to do, and that we should instead capitulate to Nazis.
So what? You're saying it'd be better for you and your family to die just so that you don't have to lose your moral high ground against your enemies. What a petty and selfish attitude. Even still, I'd actually argue that the playing out of history can tell us that fascist regimes don't work. They're unpragmatic and not worth following because they require too much energy in order to sustain long term. How many people do you really see emulating the actions of Khan or Hitler today? None, because they've been bred out via culture. Raping and pillaging is an invalid practice in today's social context. If there were still Nazis in power today, this would be an indication that there was some true component to their ideology that was useful enough to sustain their survival.
This just almost seems like you're agreeing with me that morality isn't genetically based, but is instead culturally based. Antinatalism could be the next cultural implementation, despite its weaker fitness. Just like the other moral positions that we've taken on, like monogamy, that is less fit but yet more conducive to the well-being of society.
We can get back to that, but I do still want to push back against your central premise from earlier. I do not think that we can say that pain is universally bad. Even for the people born into suffering, say with a disability, certain individuals have been able to cope with the limitations thrust upon them and have instead adapted to their suffering, making it quite meaningful for them to accept their plight. For example, in the movie My Left Foot, based on a true story where Daniel Day-Lewis is born into poverty and becomes an artist with his only working limb. Or take Stephen Hawking, who managed to unlock the mysteries of the universe despite his ALS, perhaps even partially because of it. They've each endured great suffering and yet still consider their lives to be well worth it. So who are you to say that it would have been better that they had never lived? That's a judgment that can only be made from their own personal perspective. If we ever come to think that we can determine which lives deserve to be created and which ones don't, then we become just like the Nazis and their various eugenics programs.
Except that I'm not saying that certain lives deserve to exist while others don't. I'm saying that all lives are a net negative for those that come into existence compared to not existing. You've presented no argument against my case that pain is always bad, even if the victim happens to adapt to it.
What about,
He thinks,
congenital analgesia, where someone is born unable to feel any sort of pain? It's a horrible disease. Children born with it usually accidentally poke themselves in the eye as babies and go blind. That right there is an instance where the ability to experience pain would be better than to never feel pain. Thus, I have falsified your thesis that the presence of pain is always a negative.
Sure, if you do already exist, I'd agree that being able to feel pain would be necessary for healthy survival. That actually makes my case even stronger. That if healthy survival requires the ability to feel pain, then this means that existence is also a negative, because it requires having to experience negative subjectivity in order to survive. Any system which requires death and suffering for it to function properly is an indication that that system is corrupt and ought to be dismantled.
Thomas is silent for a second, so Samuel turns towards John. Rational egoism. He thinks back.
Now you, John, You hold that the actions of individuals should be based upon the self-interests for those individuals. You're apparently an objectivist, right? I've never actually met one in person before. Is it true that you hold no responsibility towards helping anyone if it doesn't somehow align with your own self-interest?
No. Well, sort of. The reason I might help them, even if it's not in my direct self-interest, is because I'm aware of how my actions affect the society that I live in and would like to live in. If I help someone on the side of the road, I do that because I want to live in a society where, if I were on the side of the road, I'd appreciate it if somebody helped me. I have a responsibility to be the change that I want to see in the world.
I see. Sort of like Kant's categorical imperative then, that we should only do things that we would accept as being universally applied principles.
Fuck no. Kant's philosophy was retarded. A categorical imperative misses the crucial component for an ethic. The imperative part. Why ought I treat others according to a universally applicable maxim? Just because? No. Aristotelian ethics are derived from a simple foundational question. Would you rather live or die? Assuming you'd rather continue living, there are necessities for how to act so as to facilitate that. Because if I were to treat all people equally, that gives me no justification for favoring any person greater than any other. So I'd be unable to love only one person and unable to befriend only a few people. Kantianism makes it so that you can never make qualitative judgments of people or objects in general, leaving you necessarily with only an action. It's garbage.
I don't get that from Kant at all. What have you read? Actually, it doesn't even matter. What is your take on objective morality then?
Morality is objective, insofar as I am an objective figure that exists and have a need to be happy. Thus, there are requirements for my actions to achieve that. This form of objective morality is different from the religious conception, where there are authoritarian obligations imposed upon me against my will that run contrary to my own personal self-interest. Using objectivism instead, people will choose to be good because they prefer being good, instead of being threatened to be good against your will, like a slave under his master.
And what if certain people whose desires and self-interests are towards the harm of others, such as sadists and psychopaths? Are their personal interests equal to everyone else's? Or is their interests subordinate to a higher point of moral standard than just people's individualistic preferences? Because it seems from your point of view, there would be no obligation for the psychopath to act according to society's standards over their own.
No, they would still have an obligation, but that obligation doesn't have to be towards anyone other than themselves. I'll explain. I, and everyone, has an obligation to act according to their own future self-interests and needs, because our present self is always going to become our future self, and then we will have to suffer the consequences of our actions and choices. It would still be in the psychopath's self-interest to refrain from his short-term pleasure-seeking tendencies, in order to avoid being sent to prison and having his autonomy restricted, assuming, of course, he values his own autonomy. And even if he were to get away with it, he'd have to live in fear from police and wouldn't be able to connect meaningfully with people. They'd live out their entire lives in loneliness and misery, hidden away from all others. By violating the non-aggression principle and enacting coercive force against others, that person gives up their right to being treated according to that principle and can justifiably be punished.
And what if he did see it as within his interests to live like that, perhaps through self-hatred or some other reason? Maybe he's an introvert that doesn't care for the company of others. Or take, for example, a woman with self-esteem issues who returns to abusive relationships because she feels that she deserves it. Can a person's perceptual self-interests be incorrect?
Yes, they can be incorrect about what they value, just like they can be incorrect about what is best for them. If you're being an idiot and eat nothing but pizza, your body's going to fall apart, deservedly so, for being unhealthy, which is why we require a rational connection to reality to know these types of things. Self-hatred is an irrational position that is not sustainable to hold and will inevitably die out, either through suicide or through environmental repercussions. And outside of having any sort of subjective agent capable of making decisions, morality cannot exist. But before we get into that, I want to return the question to you. Can a person's subjective impression of their own well-being be incorrect?
No. Negative subjective experiences are equivalent to negative states. Nocebo effects from psychological trickery also fits within the category of harm, because it is still a negative experience for the subject. Okay, bringing it back for you. Is it wrong for someone to impose their own desires onto someone else to have to fulfill?
Absolutely it's wrong. That's slavery.
Then, is it wrong to create a person to satisfy your desires?
No, because the person that you create will also come to have their own desires. So it would still be within their self-interest to come to exist. See, you're going on about desires and non-desires like there's some sort of metaphysical property. A subject without desires is not a subject, and desires cannot go fulfilled or unfulfilled except by the existence of that subject.
He rubs his head.
I'm not invoking anything metaphysical here. I am speaking about objective states, one versus another. Through certain actions I partake in, a person could exist and suffer because of it. We are analyzing whether or not we should allow that to happen.
Purely potential people cannot be wronged or benefited, only actual people. Giving autonomy and choice to people that exist is considered a good thing, and within non-existence, choice is missing, so that's a bad thing. Therefore, it is better for someone to exist than to not.
Except there are those that come to regret having been brought into existence. So they were given an autonomous life that has been nothing but a negative for them. That would be an instance where you have created a person with self-interests that come in conflict with their very existence, which seems to break your assertion that giving people choices is always a good thing. Simply providing a choice between two bad options does not seem to be a good in and of itself. For if I tell you that either your mom or your dad is going to die and give you the choice between the two, that would be a choice that would haunt you for the rest of your life. A greater wrong than to leave you without that choice.
My dad actually is dead.
Well, I'm very sorry to hear that. That's awful.
It's fine.
Samuel analyzes him to confirm. Then he continues.
My point is, to make the decision to create a human life, one is always unaware as to whether that life will enjoy being alive, or will suffer immeasurably from it. If we were to only consider our own interests, we would be in the violation of the non-aggression principle by causing life to come into suffering through our actions. There is no way to attain consensual acceptance of harm from the person that would be the most affected until after the fact. And because we cannot be sure that they would accept such harms being imposed upon them, we should advocate against any and all procreation. By bringing a child into the world, you are condemning it to be harmed, and we are forcing another person to be an unconsenting slave to the nature of existence. A figurative child sacrifice towards their own desires.
What a horrible outlook to have. Why do you even advocate for this? Just seems to me like a way to justify your misery and wallow in self-pity, avoiding the responsibility of solving your own problems.
Nice ad hominem. But I believe it's because it's true, John. I'm not willing to let people justify their harming of others by their retreating into delusion and avoiding reality. No problems are ever solved. They are only ever pushed forward into the future for others to have to suffer through, or are forgotten with time. Antinatalism is the only solution to the problem of inherent suffering to life.
But all your solutions are merely returns to neutral states, not actually converting the bad to good. So it's inaccurate to say that it's actually better to not exist, because you can't harm or benefit people that don't exist.
The mere avoidance of harm can be considered a good act, such as if I kept the bombing from occurring. That would be good to do. And I disagree. I don't think that we should only consider the values of those that already exist before making judgments on how to treat others. We can also consider the values that the potential subject would have if they were to come into existence.
But that was your very method for disregarding the desires in the first place. You can't just take into account what they would avoid while leaving out all the things they would likely seek out. You have to be consistent in your epistemology.
Thank you for pointing this out, but I am actually being quite consistent. I recognize that if they were to exist, they'd have desires, and I'm only considering the potential harm that they'd have, because that is the only capacity to control that those that already exist have over those that do not. As you said earlier, I have no responsibility towards acting upon the values of others in order to make them happy, for that is an imposition upon their personal autonomy and responsibility. However, I do have certain restrictions in how I should treat them, such as by not instigating coercive force against them or harming them, as with the non-aggression principle. Now, I have a question for you, John. Do you think that the decision to have children should be only analyzed according to the interests and values of the prospective parents and not those of the prospective child?
Prior to birth, yes. I believe that is the case. Their existence should be the choice of their parents who can make that decision, because they currently do not fully exist as an individual person yet. And also because prior to birth, we have no idea as to what their interests or needs shall become until they do so.
Well, except we actually can. As with all sciences, we can observe nature and develop understandings about it that will hold true now and into the future. I see that there are at least two fundamental truths about the desires and self-interests of biological organisms. One is to survive. Two is to not experience pain. Now, when making our calculations for the prospective child's existence, we can know that what would be the case if they were to exist. One, they will inevitably die. And two, they will inevitably experience pain, both contradicting the potential being's inevitable self-interests that they would come to have, thereby proving that childbirth is immoral, because it is an imposition of suffering and limitations onto a being that will have needs, interests, and desires that will inevitably go unfulfilled. While, if they did not exist, they'd have no such desires to be met and could not be wronged in any way.
He shakes his head.
Pain is simply an unpleasantness of reality. It's not a moral evil. I can attempt to avoid pain, much like I can attempt to avoid annoying co-workers. But that doesn't mean that I wish that they didn't exist. I question this unstated axiom you have. Does a non-existent being, whatever that would entail, have a right to not suffer? How did they get such a right? Does simply existing grant me the right to be the greatest person alive? Do I automatically deserve to get the life of Jeff Bezos? No, of course not. The only rights that I have are those that have earned. What? The only rights that I have are those that I have earned. There's a missing I there, John.
No, it's right there.
Wait, that was my cursor. The only rights I sorry, let me recompose myself. The only rights that I have are those that I have earned. Those that do not exist do not have any such right for how I must or must not treat them, since there is no them to act in respect to. And since there is no current subject, then there is no right not to be condemned to suffer. Not that I actually think that existence is suffering. And honestly, I think that the fact that you do is more telling of your personal psychological state than it is of the truth of reality. You're just like the socialists. You think that just because subjects have certain requirements to living, that means that they have a right to take those resources from others, and that they should use the state to do the dirty work for them. A person's existence does not simply make them deserving of my respect, nor my property.
I'm not sure why you're suddenly going into your uber-libertarian diatribe, because that's all entirely irrelevant to this discussion here today. No, no one deserves to live a life of luxury simply for existing, nor do they deserve to live a life of misery simply for existing. And yet it still happens, meaning that reality as it is does not correspond with how we wish it to be. This dissonance causes suffering for all that come to exist. Thus, existence ought to be avoided for all those who we can keep from reaching this point of existential frustration. Now, I need to move on.
John leans back in his seat to try to think. Mysticism. Samuel turns towards Lindsay.
Now, let me think. That's right. You're advocating for moral relativism, or at least against moral universalism. Now, I'm not sure if you're aware of this or not, but when you said it's wrong for me to impose a universal moral standard onto everyone, by saying that, you were indeed imposing a universal moral standard onto me and expecting me to comply with it.
She says nothing.
Besides that, though, you said that certain people will come to the conclusion that the creation of new life is morally wrong, while others might see it as the best thing that they could do. Now, if it seems that we're not able to agree on our values, surely we might still be able to agree on what are facts, right? Such as the fact that this podium right in front of me, and I am speaking right now. So let me ask you, what do you think of the fact that every human has the desire to survive as well as the desire to not feel pain, and that both of these desires will always go unmet?
Except you forgot our primary motivator for action, the experience of pleasure. Our desires are not a constant within us. I might have a desire for food one moment and one for sex another. The desire for survival can be overtaken by the desire to sleep eternally. If someone wishes to die, it is their right to do so. Suffering and death anxiety are only a byproduct of egocentrism, and is not universal. But there are certain mental states that cause one to feel comfortable with letting go of their sense of ego, and with it, the fear of death. See, we have this idea here that in the West, there's an I that is myself. But the thing is, nobody actually is this atomized individual that we all pretend to be. I'm always reliant upon others for my existence. My parents, my boss, my customers, the farmers of the country, the microbes within me, the entire universe itself. And since I cannot exist apart from all of these things, that means I must be a part of them. All is one. No single being ever comes into or out of existence. They all already exist in some form or another, and will continue to exist in some form or another for the rest of eternity.
This just seems like semantics. And I disagree with you that these facts are not universal. The understanding that death is bad is absolutely foundational. Otherwise, we would have no laws against murder, or we wouldn't try to structure societies in such a way as to avoid war with other countries. Or to go back to your original case, it would not have been wrong for the colonialists to slaughter the Native Americans and pillage their land. Just the cultural idea that they held at the time. No truth or falsity to it. Now, even if you disagree that there is such a thing as an ego, surely as you recognize that there is a distinct difference between a person being alive and dead, right?
Sure, but it's quite the show of narcissism to say that you know the entirety to what all those differences are. You don't know what happens after you die. Consciousness could be fundamental and unable to be extinguished.
Samuel grimaces.
Maybe, but we can at least know that there's a difference between not existing and existing, right? Since we have no memories prior to our birth, we can reasonably assume that consciousness becomes created, and that the new consciousness will come to experience suffering and pain. And if it had not been born, it would have never had to go through those negative experiences.
But that still leaves out all of the good reasons to come into existence, because there are certain states of consciousness that are not merely the expulsion of suffering, but of eternal bliss, which people will willfully go through hours of suffering just in order to get a few minutes of that bliss, meaning that the good is an ever more valuable experience than the bad. It carries a greater subjective weight.
Okay, I believe I'm understanding your position. However, please note that I'm not attempting to compare the weights of pain and pleasures against each other to reach my conclusion. My position is purely helped by the recognition of the asymmetry to existence. If we compare a person's life that is spent in pure bliss against a world where the person never came into existence, the pleasure and good experience in the first scenario would only be good for the person that exists. If he did not exist, there would be no one that missed out on that pleasurable life.
Except that pleasure is a communal activity that multiplies with people added. It's not a material resource that can only be divided in a zero-sum game, nor is it the pleasure had by one person only singularly had. Rather, it radiates across the cosmos. We're all a part of this superorganism that acts for the benefit of each of its parts, a fractal of the interconnected universe.
Samuel rubs his head.
But there's still an asymmetry, Lindsay, because I can have no control over other people's subjective positive experiences, or even my own, in fact. I cannot simply will myself to become happy or healthy in the same way that I cannot will myself $1 million to appear in my bank account. My case is this: I can be certain that someone will suffer if they exist, but I cannot be certain that they'll experience a higher amount of pleasure than pain during their life that will meet their level of justification. It's impossible for me to be sure that a potential child will be free from all suffering and pain, except for if I do not have that child, because there can never be anyone that is harmed by not coming into existence. This is why I advocate for antinatalism, because continued existence is a desire only had by those that already exist, not by those that do not.
Unless reincarnation is correct.
He's stunned for a second.
What?
If reincarnation is real, the souls of people that have lived in the past will have no place to go. They'll be stuck in the spirit plane, unable to do anything to change the world around them, trapped for eternity.
Samuel blinks.
Do you believe in reincarnation?
I don't know. There's a lot of evidence for it. As I always say, nothing's automatically impossible. It's all just a matter of evidence. There's evidence that children hold memories of their past lives that's then corroborated with research and facts. They even sometimes remember their past self and how they died. Also, for the Dalai Lama, there are tests put into place that is to confirm Also, for the Dalai Lama, there are tests put into place to confirm that it is in fact the same one that came before. I mean, I don't know for sure, but is it really that strange to consider?
Samuel partially rolls his eyes.
Not entirely, and I'll agree with that rule of yours, but we must actually know what the evidence actually indicates. For instance, testimony from children is incredibly faulty in ascertaining the truth, because they are very good at reading what those in authority are inquiring about, and will tell them whatever stories they think that we want to hear. There was a series of horrible satanic sexual abuse scandals in the 80s that got over 30 innocent people convicted just from childhood testimony and paranoid parents. And the tests for the Dalai Lama are hardly rigorous, giving a child 10 different items to choose from, where 4 of them have belonged to the previous Lama. Sure, the odds would be quite unlikely for the child to pick out those exact 4. However, when you run this test on multiple children, say over 100, the likelihood one of them will pick out the exact right items suddenly becomes inevitable.
Sure, but you can always just make up a psychological explanation to try to dismiss anything.
And you can also just do the same thing to justify anything.
He waves both of his hands.
But regardless of all of that, my argument would still not change if it did turn out that reincarnation was possible. All I require for my argument is the observation of the two perfectly self-evident truths. One, it is wrong to cause people to suffer unnecessarily, which is commonly accepted within both Buddhist and Jainist ethics. And two, during life, every person will experience suffering at some point. Also something recognized by the Buddha in his first noble truth, that life is suffering. Therefore, unless you can provide a justifiable reason why it is necessary to bring about a human life just so that it can experience suffering, then antinatalism is the obvious conclusion we must reach.
Well, I mean, we can't be absolutely certain that it wouldn't be unnecessary.
Come on, Lindsay, you're obscuring the problem here. Do not use the fact that we can't be epistemically certain of anything to justify committing immoral acts of harm against the innocent. Surely we have good reason to believe that they would experience some sort of needless suffering, that they would have preferred not having to go through during their life. So that makes it a negative in comparison to the neutral state of not existing, thereby making non-existence better than existence.
I suppose it's likely, but not necessarily inevitable. But here's another possibility. Perhaps suffering in this life is justified karma from a past, which would not then make it an injustice to not allow for new lives to be created as punishment for the crimes that they committed in their past lives.
See, this is where I strongly dislike your reincarnation argument. I myself, and I'm sure most everyone in the West, hold absolutely no memories of any such past lives and are essentially living out our new lives as if any past mistakes or successes were all made by entirely other people. It seems completely unfair and unjust to punish or reward people who have no conscious experience of the actions from their supposed former lives. And if our system of reality is unjust, then we should not capitulate to its order. Also, as a side note, the Buddhist texts that I've read have either been ambiguous or explicitly did not regard reincarnation as a good thing, rather something that, through procreation, simply passed on the burden of eternal suffering onto others. Antinatalism is the only valid solution to the Buddhist attempt to escape suffering.
I don't know, maybe?
Anyways, if you were to have a child, they would necessarily experience something that they classify as the worst thing to ever happen to them. Why then would you force a child to have to go through that? What justification can you have?
Lindsay is quiet, thinking. John shakes his head.
The idea that the idea that no amount of pleasure is worth enduring any amount of pain is preposterous just on its face. Just think of any human presented the option of, say, receiving a paper cut followed by a payment of $1 billion would easily voluntarily accept that pain for that outcome. I mean, even you brought up how someone wanting to lose weight could willfully trade their discomfort during exercise so as to attain their goal of becoming fit and healthy. A single moment of pain in death isn't enough to invalidate an entire life full of pleasure.
That's an unrealistic example that you gave, which doesn't actually occur within real reality. Most suffering that happens never receives proper justification according to the victim standards.
Bradley butts in.
Except the positive or negative values for a thing, person, or action is all determined by how much is given up for or against that thing. Like, you can put your car up for sale for 20 grand, but if your car's 11, you're not the one who gets to set that price. Now, if you happen to find some idiot that does pay the price, then that's what makes the value of the car whatever you paid for it.
All right, we can move on to you. It's Bradley, right?
Bradley nods. Existentialism.
You seem to hold the somewhat Nietzschean position that morality is not real and believing in it only gets in the way of our nature. The will to power, I presume? What doesn't kill me makes me stronger and all that?
A better interpretation, I'd say, is the will to overcome. And the actual quote is, that which does not kill us only makes us stronger. There is no I. Whatever ends up killing the I that we call Bradley still ends up making the rest of us stronger, because Bradley, if he cannot sustain his existence, is weak. And whatever killed me is proof of its greater strength and persistence than myself. The will to power means that one must admit that there are things more powerful than yourself that demand subordination from you. Anything that does not demand this does not earn it, and thus shall not receive it.
Now, I should say I'm quite uncomfortable with the phrasing of your arguments here, since they can easily, and in fact have been, used to justify slavery as well as Nazism. But going along with it, just for the sake of argument, if you were to be hit by a bus, does that mean that the bus is now greater than yourself and thus more valuable?
Perhaps. Perhaps the will driving me to listen to audiobooks while walking down the road proved to be one that's unsustainable when put into practice due to its fatal consequences. My death would have to be subordinated to the will driving men to have a reliable public transport system. Thus, my death would be rightly deserved, and would actually be quite informative to all that might have shared in this dangerous predilection of not looking both ways before crossing the road. Reiterating my point that the price of the car is determined by whatever price is accepted. The value of all things is in regard to what people are willing to trade so as to attain or keep it. I trade my risk of death so as to attain my listening to philosophy while I walk. The city trades the risk of killing jaywalkers so as to attain a reliable public transport system. Both of us accept the risks that accompany before getting what we want. See, most people nowadays are so afraid of death that they paradoxically allow it to control and diminish their lives. Death is simply a part of life, and is the longest running and most effective way of detecting and removing weak ideas from corrupting the gene pool.
Well, okay. Even if death is a necessary part of reality, it's still a fact that you'd consider it wrong to be killed while crossing the street, right?
No, since I reject the very concept of morality. Has any murderer ever been stopped by simply telling them about how murder is wrong? The moral facts that you appeal to are nothing more than your moral dogmas that align with your intuitions. All facts only ever exist within a story that we create, which must necessarily rest upon unfounded lies. These lies are heuristics with high success rates which we don't bother inquiring further for efficiency's sake, but that does not make them facts. If it's effective 95% of the time, that gives us enough room to ignore the 5% of anomalies and call it a fact. But if we ever wish to dispute that fact, all we ever need to do is to just point back to the 5% and feel justified in rejecting the heuristic. And I'll do that now. I disagree with you, Schopenhauer and Buddha. Suffering is not a brute fact because it can be desired and cannot be considered a universal negative. The same voltage to an electric shock can feel differently from someone who thought it was done arbitrarily and someone who was told that they'll be given $1,000 after the shock. Even if that $1,000 is a lie, the pain will not be a negative. By having a mindset of greatness when undergoing suffering, it can be endured, accepted, and even sought after.
Don't try to derail us, Bradley. I'm just focusing on what you've already said earlier. You're talking way too much. Now, we know that no one knowingly practices habits that would be fatal, right? And I'm sure the assumption you had while listening to your audiobooks would be that this action won't kill you, yes? And if it did kill you, then this would be an undesired surprise that happened against your will, so you'd consider this to be wrong, right?
No, no, and no. I already know that I'm going to die someday. The only surprise will be which stupid actions I take, which will precede it. I've cheated death many times so far. This game can't last forever. Besides, I disagree that people don't knowingly practice deadly habits. How else do you explain prolific cigarette, alcohol, and opiate usage?
That's just because they're addictive.
What a circular response. Why are people addicted to these substances? Why, it's because these substances are addictive. You're an idiot. Addictions do not form unless they satisfy some desire within the host. I see this elitism all the time with you types. The bourgeois assumption that every time someone does something that they cannot comprehend, it must be due to some physical or mental defect within that person. This is the racism of the left and the failure of Christianity with its doctrine of evil. The moralists like to tell others what to do saying it's within your own interests, when really they're just saying that so they don't have to feel pity when looking at those lesser than themselves. I believe that only those who are held by their moral positions should act according to those principles, and then suffer the consequences to them, not projecting your own biases universally outwards onto others who do not share into their dogmas. Let you be the first test subject for the fruits or folly of your morality. Just don't try to push it onto me, Sam. It won't stick.
So, you don't want to others imposing their morality upon you. You do realize that's exactly what happens when you create a child, right? And because there are instances where people will come to suffer needlessly.
Define needlessly.
For no justified purpose or reason.
I disagree. Justified according to whom? The lion certainly has his reason for killing the gazelle, and by that outlier gazelle's death, the other gazelles can survive another day knowing where to avoid in the future. Why should we consider the loser's need for justification? They aren't the moral arbiters to all of existence, only for their own. All information comes with a cost. One of the only types of information people can't ignore is pain, though they still love blaming it on others.
He chuckles.
Sometimes they will seek out the pain just so that they get to blame it on their enemies. There is a greater hell than living with pain, Samuel. The hell that is living without meaning. Noise without signal, arbitrariness. But he who has a why to live can bear almost anyhow. We all create our morality to encapsulate our suffering into a story, and then live for it. Victory, war, and death are how our nation's stories succeed and fail in overcoming other stories. The battlegrounds of the gods. Whichever lies that we tell ourselves gives us the power to endure a great amount of suffering than our competition. That is the god that wins. Guilt in others is the vengeance that makes our own suffering justified. See, you're using as your starting axiom, your story, is that the experience of pain is the equivalent to moral wrongness. But just because I, as a creature, experience pain, in no way does this mean that I personally wish I could have gone without feeling that pain. In fact, the pain is quite helpful in educating myself. Quite helpful in educating myself, my peers, and my progenitors on what actions to repeat or to avoid in the future. I don't consider that bad at all, and I'm the one experiencing that pain. Are you going to tell me that I'm wrong for accepting that pain is necessary to reality? Wouldn't that then be a form of denialism on your part? Are you going to impose your own moral conceptions for what you think I should desire onto me against my will? Just like how you've argued against it in saying that it's wrong to impose our own moral conceptions and desires onto the unborn against their wills?
Samuel sighs with a small amount of exasperation before speaking, but Bradley interrupts him before he can.
I do not accept the good-bad dichotomy put forward by you moralists, because antinatalism logically concludes from both moral objectivism as well as moral subjectivism. I reject both. Anything that can be looked at as having degrees of badness can instead be seen as having degrees of goodness. Even in a completely evil universe, there just be the evaluations of more bad and less bad. And to move from one to the other is an escalation for the subject and seen by them to be a benefit. Good. So the ontological categorization of things as right and wrong is both impractical and incorrect. To say all of existence is evil is just as meaningless as for me to say that all of life is good, except that your framework inhibits you from existing while mine strengthens my doing so. Taking on faith that all existence itself is a good place, a playground worth dying and killing within, enables me to continue living, while for you, to only seek out death. And you're unfortunately too cowardly to even get through it, pussy.
You're going to have to shut up every now and then, just so I can get a word in edgewise, Bradley. Let's take this one at a time. Why don't you accept the good-bad dichotomy? Is it because you think it is incorrect and therefore wrong to accept it?
Nice try. No, I simply reject it because I was fated to do so by the will controlling me. I require no further justification than that.
Fine. Now you also said something like vengeance was justification enough for suffering to occur. But an eye for an eye makes the whole world blind, Bradley. It simply degrades both of us, rather than returning the wrong party to a neutral or benefited state.
Not so. for I would gladly pay with my already lost eye to see my perpetrator also lose his. The Schadenfreude I receive makes the loss worth it. The injured eye is just a down payment.
You know what? I think you might actually be a psychopath, but I want to get something right. You seriously don't accept that bad things happen? Even things like cancer or the...
I do not accept the label bad placed upon such things. Everything can and must be evaluated against something else in order to consider it either better or worse than the original thing. There is no definitive, correct perspective that you must take. All is a matter of opinion. No specific one is correct, for every perspective has to leave out all the other perspectives and non-perspectives. Your specific story is attempting to compare a non-thing with an existing thing, which makes it possible for you to justify anything. If I postulate an imaginary heaven with infinite positive well-being while non-existence has infinite negative, then there. Now I can just use my imaginary concept, just like you defend whatever position I want. To defend whatever position I want. You can make any story or evaluation to fit any conclusion you want. Say, if I got cancer, which is usually presumed to be negative, I could instead imagine how much worse it would be if I had gotten it sooner. Or how it would have been worse if I'd have had to live out a long and boring life. Now, cancer's given me the opportunity to do all the things that a long life would have restricted. Certainly, cancer is a better outcome than all the other alternatives I've just come up with. Negative states are never some sort of objective moral reality. I'll start that again. Negative states are never some sort of objective reality, simply a moral projection of ourselves onto reality.
You do realize, though, that there are people not like you and actually do undergo experiences that they understand as being bad.
Such as yourself, you prefer to hold that the universe is evil? Why that rather than my equally false position?
He turns to the others.
Men like Samuel here have no passion for anything, and so they pretend that they are more enlightened than the plebeians like us that do. His weak genes made him rationalize his own inability to conquer his environment and made him resort to intellectual superiority over others by manipulating our pity with pretty words like morality and to try to control our actions. Being a slave to morality just means you must reject reality whenever it comes in conflict with your sensibilities, which is why I instead simply reject my moral sensibilities.
He stands up onto his pew.
Rather than becoming a slave to our moral allergies, we can instead become a slave to the most powerful thing in the universe, history. History decides who is right and who is wrong. Even the Jews and the Christians have rejected the fierce power of their original god of history making. The God that smites a man for attempting to save the Ark of the Covenant from falling into the mud. That poor fool. That dead fool is the church of the Judeo-Christian God. They think that God does not deserve to have blood on his hands, that God cannot be seen as a tyrant. And so they invent the soul with free will that can reject the power of God. They create the illusion of rationality, their intellect and morality, making idols out of these things. They worship these lifeless and unchanging idols that have no real power in the world. And so because of that, God has left his people and now expresses himself within Allah, the God of Islam. And the Christians and Jews rightfully fear that God because they rejected him so long ago. And God punishes them for rejecting him. Who caused the Twin Towers to fall? It was God. The divine will to power within man. A reminder to a secular nation just how powerful God is when we ignore or try to exploit him. To think that God expresses himself towards his people as love, like the Christians say. Nay, he expresses himself through force. Every force of the universe, especially psychology. Very rarely, if ever, does God act through the form of morality. Rather, usually through the breaking of a popular morality. Morality. Do you think that a bear cares that it's violating the non-aggression principle while it tears open your...
Samuel interrupts.
Hold up, okay. God, it's like you don't know how to stop it. Stick to just one topic at a time. Okay, there is nothing that you'd admit it would have been better if it had not existed. Nothing that you think has been evil, wrong, or bad in any sense?
As that would be in agreement with your own position, I'm going to say no.
No, that's not how it works, Bradley. You can't just not admit to something because it agrees with someone else's position. You agree with it because it's accurate, because it's true.
There you go again, sneaking in your moral dogmas into our discussion.
What?
Truth. That's an old religious relic invented by the Greek philosophers.
You don't believe in truth?
It depends on which truth you're advocating for. A better question for me would be, how much do I value truth? How much will I give up for it? See, even our concept of things such as truth has a history behind it, such as the Christian usage of this Greek idea to rebel against the God of the ancient Hebrews. They've converted the Jewish notion of truth from that which is necessary to serve life into the Greek notion of truth, that whatever is outside of life, whatever's perfect, the unchanging, the pure, the ideal, the good, the impossible, the non-existent, which was perfectly shown through Plato's allegory of the cave. Only by exiting life can Greek truth ever be found. Thus, the fetishization of death and nihilism naturally springs forth. The problem with truth as the highest God, good or God?
God.
As the highest God, is that the concepts by which we actually think within are all irretrievably tied to our own anthropocentric needs and fleshly desires. Hence, the Gnostic rejection of the body in Christianity and Platonism. There is never any singular, correct perspective that you must take for every issue. That is to say, there's no such thing as truth.
What the hell are you even going on about? It depends on what truth I'm advocating for. There's just one type of truth, okay? A proposition is judged to be either true or false insofar as it corresponds with reality. The very statement, there's no such thing as truth, is a lie, because it's attempting to describe a truth about reality, and if your description was accurate, then it would be true, and would then make your very statement self-negating and meaningless.
A proposition is not a tangible thing, so for it to correspond with reality is itself a farce to begin with. There's no singular metaphysical binary truth property out there that propositions can or cannot hold. If there were, then it would mean that the sentence, "this sentence is false," was either false or not. See, truth is entirely contingent upon the set of principles or axioms which we impose or accept in order to procure that desired truth. A differing set will yield a different result. We have no method of corresponding our proposed truth claims with reality outside of how much power they have to cause our wills to gravitate towards them over other claims. Therefore, I can conclude that that is all that they are, nothing more.
And do you consider that to be an accurate analysis, Bradley? That example you gave of the true or false statement is just the liar's paradox. It's incoherent to try to analyze and thus can be rejected. We can actually confirm truth claims through their correspondence with or experiential data.
No, that's circular. If I put on red tinted glasses, that doesn't mean that everything I look at is red. You cannot confirm the validity of your sensory experiences simply because your sensory experiences correspond with themselves. This is what I was getting at with the liar's paradox. The statement is attempting to describe reality according to a true-false dichotomy and fails to do so when referencing itself. You simply reject the sentence as if it doesn't exist, yet it does. Thus, a denial of reality, much like the Platonists, unwilling to accept that reality isn't rational, but instead paradoxical. What we call truth is whatever aids us in manipulating our environment towards certain ends that we desire.
And can we agree that the universe exists, right?
That's a belief I hold, yes.
He bites his tongue.
I'm going to move on to someone I can at least agree with on reality in just a moment. But first I want to confirm something you said, which I don't actually think you believe, although I could very well be wrong. There are absolutely no acts that people have done that you would consider wrong. What about the Holocaust? 6 million people needlessly killed.
Well, I'm not so sure about that specific number.
Oh my god. Here's a question for you, Bradley. Was Hitler wrong in doing what he did? This is not a hard question, Bradley. Yes or no?
As whatever answer I give would confirm your position, and since from my own framework it is a meaningless question, I'll refrain from answering.
So that's a no then? Wrong answer, Bradley. I'm moving on.
It's not wrong. It's not even an answer. Because the formulation of your question makes it so that I can't answer. Exactly like my question I gave to you of is this sentence is false, a false statement. You're conceiving of right and wrong as if they are ontological properties inherent to the actions or objects, but evaluations are in reference to other objects or actions in a comparative way. That's like asking if an object contains a property with bigness or smallness within it. Nothing can be considered wrong without first comparing the thing in question against something we prefer or dislike, which is the product of a willpower. A will to create a selection of measurement in order to reach the conclusion of there being a rightness or wrongness to an object. And since I do not see the comparisons as being something that can be truth apt, I cannot answer the question satisfyingly.
Okay, wait. Comparisons can so be truth apt. If I say that the population of Switzerland is lesser than that of China, that's an accurate comparison being made.
Except numbers aren't real, bro.
Samuel grabs his hair.
Okay, I'm done. I think I've sufficiently discovered and proven that you are not worth speaking to, and you have nothing to add to this conversation. If you would like to your payment now, you are fully welcome to leave.
Nah, that's okay, I'll stay.
Samuel's pleading.
Then please just be quiet.
He looks at his watch.
Actually, you know what? We'll take a break here and come back in 10 minutes.
All right, that is an actual break that we're actually going to do in real life as well.
Oh, thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Jendrik. Good so far. You've been really nailing it. All right, we're going to be going. We're going to take a 10-minute break for everyone, so we can just mute our microphones, and then we will carry on in. Oh wow, it's almost perfectly 11 a.m. where I'm at. So yeah. We'll be back in 10 minutes, everybody.
10 minutes. All right. Thank you.
Oh my God.
You must be exhausted, Samuel.
Yeah. I mean, then again, Bradley kind of had a long stretch too. All the long monologues, but
You've had like multiple long stretches every single segment.
yeah. Well, I guess one advantage of playing Bradley is that he, for his part, doesn't speak quite as aggressively as I make Samuel speak.
Yeah.
So.
Man, you've been doing a good job though, Jendrik.
Minus the fact that I might have been paying slightly too much attention to the chat. That's missing my stuff.
Yeah, bloody John. John's like a laughing track for his own play.
Yeah,
It's like listening to a Big Bang Theory TV show, and John's just here laughing. Yeah.
oh, well.
Nah, it's good. Everyone's having a good time. And everyone's doing such a good job. I was just like, when everyone's done the bit, I'm like, oh my God, I need to step up my game. But then my character is always just like a frustrated individual. So,
I thought you were great.
cool. Thanks, Katie.
Oh yeah, you were also very funny. You clearly aren't as anything like your character, Katie. It is very obvious.
I'm sorry.
No, you've been doing a great job. Like,
We can tell you tried.
Thanks. I think.
But then again, I don't think you would want to be like your character. So
No, I'm not quite as emotional. I mean, I have my moments, but
yeah, no, you're not that much.
Yeah,
but
Jen,
oh, what about the poor indigenous people?
Yeah, I know. No, not you.
Jendrik wrote in the chat as soon as you started. He's like, one can tell Katie really has to try hard to sound as pathetically childlike as Lindsay is.
I love it.
Which is one of Jendrik's like what would you call it? Backhanded compliment, like where the backhand's going to the character,
Yes.
the compliment's going to the actor. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I can do pathetic. I can be really pathetic, which is why she's perfect for me.
Anyway,
Now
I
you-
think I'll take a quick breath for a break too.
Yeah, go for it, Jendrik. Oh,
Yeah,
man.
this break is essentially your break, Jendrik.
yeah, that's the only time that he gets a chance to actually not take every other line. That was funny how like he was surprised when I think you had to interrupt for one of the lines, and he started to read your line just because it was so used to going one after the other.
Yeah, I can't believe I thought that I was the cursor though, because that's exactly like the text cursor.
Oh yeah.
I was like,
Yeah, don't worry about it all. Like all of you guys are doing just great. I'm absolutely loving this. Oh, I'm so happy.
I swapped out my microphone. I was using my webcam's microphone because that's fine for like our meetings, but then for the for this, I was like, oh crap, I should actually use the good microphone because this is a live recording. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it sounds good.
Yeah, well now it's the lanyard, so this should be a lot better than what it was before. Hopefully, we'll cross our fingers. Yeah.
Yeah, we're still alive, Phalanx, even though we said we were going to take a break. It's just giving us a chance to cool off from doing the readings at least.
No, that was you're hilarious, Ben. You're great. You're so much fun.
Cool. Yeah, this will be like my third iteration of it because the first when I first read it, I read like the first 15 minutes and I was just like, my God, I'm so frustrated by Samuel. And I was like, I'm just gonna read my parts because I'm also such a slow reader. And then I'm reading my parts. I'm like, oh man, I actually align a lot with the character I'm playing. So John selected it quite well for me, except a few positions I don't hold, but mostly he would say the objections I'm holding. So.
Right. Yeah.
I'm
Yeah,
really
this-
getting into the character.
Oh yeah. Not too much, hopefully.
I have to say,
That's the
like
idea.
when it comes to Lindsay, I was Lindsay for like 15 minutes after I had my son, and then I went back to being, a jerk again. But I had that my emotions moment.
Yeah. A lot of these characters are like amalgamations of different people I've interacted with and met and just listened to a lot of them. So there's very much these types of kind of like new age types like Lindsay that are out there that almost kind of very spiritual but not religious, that type. Kind of a classic archetype. I'm actually surprised with how good we're doing on time, because I was afraid like for any mistakes we might be making that we'd have like be going 10 or so minutes over, but no, this is like pretty much right on schedule for 3 hours.
No. No, it'll probably be 3.5 hours, right? Because we're
I'm back.
Oh yeah,
Yeah,
We're 2
well,
hours through, right?
Hmm?
Okay.
Huh?
Are we halfway through? 2 hours through?
we're halfway.
Barely. The thing has 131 pages.
what page are we on? We're on
Page 77.
yeah, we're on page 70. So yeah, I guess we're halfway through.
We're over halfway. We're good. We're good.
Okay. Yeah, so it will be going a little bit over.
I
Sorry,
haven't actually
everybody.
read to the end, so
Yeah.
Oh, this will be exciting then for you.
it will.
Yeah.
I hope I get to pull out the gun.
What's the matter? What? Oh, you haven't read the section. Well, no.
I haven't read any of it past this point, actually.
So it'll be surprising for you. Yeah, I don't want to give away any spoilers, but there's a couple of like things that I allude to at the beginning that I never actually follow through with. So the script itself is very much kind of a still working progress. Like I'm gonna have to so a couple of people have noticed in the chat that all the characters kind of sound the same in a lot of ways. Like sure, they're arguing different positions, but they're kind of doing it from the same like way of talking. So that's something I would need to do before making this into like a a real professional thing, is to rewrite the dialogue just so it sounds more natural to specific characters.
Especially Bradley was a little funny in that respect. I mean, you're portraying him as some sort of psychopath. He does seem very reasonable, all things considered. He also seems to know a lot about philosophy, considering how irreverent you typically expect a psychopath to be. So the way he's being played reflects that irreverence, but it doesn't really reflect how much he seems to know about philosophy. It's a bit of a difficult situation, I'd say.
I don't know. There's a lot of people who are clued on like all the Twitter 4chan trolls. Like they're pretty switched on, and they just kind of get off on trolling people. That seems to be bad. Like,
that's pretty much like what Bradley is.
Do they know that much about philosophy? I don't really encounter Twitter 4chan trolls.
I mean, there's like not much else that they would do. Just sit around, listen. Well, like he kind of brings it up in the script that he like spends all his free time listening to philosophy. Like I imagine him doing it like at the gym. He'll just like listen to the Beyond Good and Evil as an audiobook.
In that aspect, that he reminds me of me.
Yeah, that's kind of the thing. There's a lot of elements of the characters that are aligned with myself in a lot of ways. So it's very interesting to see them actually battle it out against each other and through rhetorical dialogue.
You mean the 24-year-old guy named John who has an interest in philosophy bears a minor resemblance to you?
Well, it's funny because like the character I named John is actually pretty far away from like my own position. I used to like
the one closest to John's position is Katie.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Okay then.
Guilty.
I maybe shouldn't have called her pathetically like that. Oh God, no.
But no, this is so much fun so far. I'm really enjoying it. I love it.
Right.
I mean, I technically expected to have dinner around 7, but I guess that won't work. It's 6 here now. So.
Yeah. Sorry, it'll have to be going on for like another probably hour and a half.
So yeah.
Yeah, I guess so. Sorry, Jendrik. And also sorry, both Ben and Phalanx. I know it's real late for you guys over there.
I'm personally surprised that it doesn't seem to be taking too much of a toll on my voice, but okay.
Now make sure all of you guys have like water nearby you. It's been very helpful.
Yeah, I actually emptied my bottle within the first like 20 minutes last time.
Well, yeah, that's when you're doing the entire monologue, so that's understandable.
The advantage is that I didn't have to go to the toilet in between.
That's good.
Like another 30 seconds or so.
Yep. All right. Let me get back.
No idea how you could stay the entire time with your 5-gallon jug of water standing nearby.
Yes, I've got it right next to me. All right. You guys all here?
Yep.
All right.
All good to go.
All right, good. We're gonna be starting then. All right. Starting at just the top of page 70. Actually, just a couple lines before. So here we go. Is ought. Samuel returns the basket of phones back into the podium.
All right. Anyone who'd...
Here is my argument that I've been working on. 1, beings that do not exist have no preference one way or the other towards being brought into existence. And 2, beings that do exist do have a preference towards having been brought into existence and continuing to do so. Therefore, it is within all subjective preferences to be brought into existence.
Premise 2 is flatly correct. Not everyone does have the preference to continue existing. The suicide rate in the US has increased by 33% since 1999. All being examples of people that considered it better for them not to exist. So essentially damning evidence against your premise.
Hold up. Premise 2 was based on what you had said was a fundamental fact about biology. that all existing creatures have a preference to survive that will inevitably go unfulfilled. Are you just disagreeing with yourself then?
No, I was disagreeing on the premise that all people do prefer having been brought into existence. My own case being sufficient evidence against that position. All people, even those that commit suicide, would have preferred to continue existing if given better circumstances. But because they did not have those circumstances, they recognized that to continue living in such a state would be unbearable for themselves. The only legitimate reasons for imposing suffering onto others that I can imagine are either to do so for the greater good of the person, such as vaccinations of a child, or because they consent to it, as in BDSM relationships. However, the non-existents have no way in which they can either be benefited nor any way in which they can consent, leaving us with no reason to cause them to exist and good reason not to do so.
John is silent, so Thomas stands up.
Here's the big problem that you haven't covered yet. Logically, as shown through Hume, you cannot derive an ought from an is. That is to say, you cannot get any prescriptive values out of any set of descriptive facts. This is the fundamental problem for all moralities attempted be made under philosophical realism, which it seems you hold to, the belief that all there is out there are facts. Now, the existential problem is that as creatures capable of action, we require some sort of framework of decision making. But decisions for how to act cannot be made using only dry and detached facts about what things are. This leads me to conclude that since decisions are made all of the time, they must always be done in reference to feelings, not on facts. A pertinent quote also from Hume: "Reason is and ought always only to be a slave of the passions." You see, you have way too much faith that our human rationality can adequately establish moral behavior over ourselves. But, I mean, hell, I can't even get myself to stop eating carbs. That's the thing. Facts require an intuitive emotional force behind them in order to convert them into oughts that motivate people into action. And if your argument does not cause that intuitive force within me to be compelled, then I have no choice left but to disagree with your prescriptions given to us. This is why I think philosophical realism is insufficient, and why I still consider myself an American pragmatist. Because pragmatism expands our thinking about beliefs, not only in regards to their factual correlation with reality, but also how those beliefs influence the actions of an organism in respect to their goals. Thereby, the outcome of a belief put into practice is itself a property of that belief, as a marker of its validity or its invalidity. Herein lies a way that many religions can be considered true in some sense, because they are effective at achieving the goals that the believers uphold as desirable. And here's where antinatalism, if you consider its goal to be the voluntary extermination of the human race, could be considered false in some sense, because its overall effect would only be the weeding out of all the most moral people from the gene pool by keeping them from breeding, just to leave behind only all the irrational and the immoral people that do not agree with antinatalism to keep on breeding, making the world exponentially worse off, even according to the antinatalists' own standard. I mean, have you ever seen the movie Idiocracy?
No, I haven't, but I'm familiar with the premise, and it is something that worries me. However, I don't think the is-ought dilemma is really all it's cracked up to be. Because the assertion that you cannot derive prescriptive claims from descriptive ones is either a prescriptive claim that is not derived from any basis in our observations of reality and only accepted by fools, or it is a descriptive claim that is based upon our observations of reality, making the very statement self-negating. You can indeed derive oughts from is's so long as there are qualitative features to reality, objective values to reality, which I wholeheartedly believe in. The subjective experience of pain is one such negatively qualitative example that I use.
He grabs his water bottle and takes a drink.
Now, if Hume was right, that reason is only whatever the passions dictated to. then it would be equally reasonable for me to say that reason is not simply dictated by the passions, for currently that is what my passions are telling me. Meaning that whatever Hume is referring to as reason is not the same thing I am referring to, because I abide by the law of identity and non-contradiction. A thing cannot be both affirmed and denied at the same time while being considered reasonable.
But you're still just accepting the law of non-contradiction and identity because you prefer them. They have no objective basis in reality, just abstract tools that we can't help but use. But this says nothing about these laws of logic being real in any sense as fact.
I'm not sure why you're so against having facts underlie your morality instead of, I guess, or innate and vague intuitions. I honestly don't think they're that different, really. Someone's intuition is just a fact or set of facts about the subject that they haven't yet been able to articulate. But by going on about articulating it into an actual claim, we can now reason with each other to determine the claim's validity or not, instead of simply having our unspoken feelings driving us into conflict with others. By keeping our intuitions vague, we inevitably bring forth infighting, because when one does not have the words to speak, all that's left is violence. So even pragmatically speaking, concrete reasoning with facts is better than vague intuition. Now, Hume is right in some sense, though, for if we only had a sterile third-person scientific perspective on reality, without the inclusion of first-person experience and values, then we would not be able to derive logical conclusions for how to act. But as we do have our subjective lenses that we must view the world through, and to not do so would be an empirical exclusion of data, we can and do use them to make decisions for what we ought to do. Now, the singular ethical framework that I use for deriving oughts and making decisions is the well-being of conscious creatures. If an act harms even a stuck in some way, then we should act so as to keep that harm from occurring, insofar as we are capable of doing so without causing even greater amounts of harm to occur.
But that still implicitly assumes that conscious creatures are intrinsically valuable, and that whatever their opinion is of a thing being either right or wrong makes that thing so. How are you not a moral relativist again? How can you differentiate two opposing opinions of a thing's moral value?
I'm not a relativist because I do think that people can be mistaken as to what is both right and wrong and what is of value. Say you found a painting, one that you thought was a Monet, and you sold their house for this painting. But then it turned out this wasn't actually one of Monet's paintings. It was a fake. The value for the painting was certainly subjectively held and acted upon by you, but that value was not an accurate knowledge of reality. If I think that a slug has no capacity to feel pain, except it does, I'd be incorrect in my assessment and I'm in the wrong for pouring salt onto it. All creatures have the drive to survive built into them by evolution. Using that fact as our starting axiom, further odds are automatically built up from there.
But that just sounds like my position. Wouldn't that axiom contradict antinatalism? The statement, I ought to survive, relies upon the unstated value that it's better to be alive than to be dead.
Not exactly. It could instead be supported by the value that it's worse to die than it is to not to die. And even though we hold these positions to be true in most cases, there are still instances where individuals disagree. There are many that go through life under the reality that it would be better for them not to be alive, yet they are.
This is what I was trying to get at. Antinatalism isn't a universalizable ethic because your current existence relies upon the natalist actions of your parents. And had they not done so, you'd be unable to argue your point here today. So if you're a Kantian, it can't be considered a categorical imperative because to will for all to not have children, even your own parents, is to will against your own existence and capacity to will in the first place.
Yeah, well, I don't really fully subscribe to Kant's ethical theories anyways. I'm more of a negative utilitarian than a deontological ethicist. For in the philosophical thought experiment known as the trolley problem, Kantian would be bound by the categorical imperative to not flip the switch on the tracks to kill the one person but save 10. Real life means that hard choices need to be made to serve the greatest good, or rather, prevent the worst outcome. But we should probably try to move on to another topic now, as we have just 1 hour left.
He checks his watch.
I have a question. What made you become an antinatalist? Maybe we can better grasp your points by knowing more about yourself.
I do not believe that my position requires any sort of sob story from myself in order to justify. The case is abundantly clear from purely irrational perspective. I aim not to manipulate all of you by clouding it through emotional tactics.
Well, we humans require emotional arguments sometimes to convince us. So, since you've already made your point, speaking logically, now speak to us personally.
Samuel is quiet for a moment.
No. No matter what I might say about my upbringing, which was no worse off than most people born in the world today, you will attempt to psychologize my position in order to write off the arguments I've made thus far. My childhood upbringing bears no relation to the straightforward case that I have presented here today.
I'm curious then, what are you hoping to accomplish here today, and what are your longer-term goals?
I aim to persuade people to do what is right.
And if you fail at this endeavor, if none of us are convinced in an hour, what indication does this have towards your theory that humans can be persuaded purely by rational argumentation?
It would unfortunately indicate that long-standing cultural pressures are more powerful than dialectic reasoning, something I've already known for quite some time now, actually.
So if that's the case, then does this not undermine your own certainty in your position? If all of us can retain our irrational positions despite powerful and rational antithetical arguments presented to us, how likely is it that your own position is not also irrationally based in some way? And perhaps you were driven to it not by these surface level logical abstractionings that you've put forth, but rather something deeper, perhaps psychological or sociological. Is there something deeper that caused you to reach your stance that's more foundational to you than these various defenses you've created and presented to us? Perhaps if you share it, it might closer align with our emotional intuitions and have a greater chance of persuading us. For how is it that we could agree with your premises until we've already decided we'd like to agree with the conclusion?
Because it's logically sound, Thomas, and that's how we rationally consider propositions. I have enough trust in all of your intellectual capacities that you will be able to follow the argument to its conclusion without any sort of personal or emotional anecdotes from myself manipulating you. What do you want me to play you the footage of the sea turtles again? Every creature born on this planet is bred for death, and not only death, but for the agonizing suffering that precedes it. And even worse than that, they're bred to not want to die. Every person you know has or will experience the worst thing to ever happen to them. Everyone that gives birth to them is responsible for that happening. From this, I can see no good reasons to ever create another person.
Except for the survival of the species.
Survival of the species is not a good reason, because it's simply the vehicle that allows us for more suffering to occur. Besides, survival of the species is really a myth anyways, because there's nothing that actually survives from the act of genetic reproduction. If I take a picture of the Mona Lisa and then I burn the painting, I can't defend myself by saying, it's okay, she survived the fire, it's right here on my phone. The replication of the thing is not equivalent to its original.
John speaks up.
What if, through technological progress, comfort and well-being are achieved for everyone across the world, such that we've cured cancer, disease, pestilence, even pain and death? Then would life be worth it to you?
So the question is growth good? And for whom? Does where we are now somehow justify or make right all the wrong actions taken during our history? Numerous amounts of suffering was had, billions of deaths. Was it worth it? Will it ever be worth it? Does having Netflix and McDonald's somehow make the atrocities committed during World War II all right suddenly? Would having an ideal utopian future be enough to justify every rape, murder, war, genocide, human sacrifice, child death, starvation, accidental death, unbearable heartache, our traumatic experience, forgotten life, everything horrible that has happened in our past? And will still continue to happen until we finally reach this conception of a utopia that you speak of? I say no.
So now I have to justify all those bad things? Why? There's nothing that can be done about them. They're in the past. The only thing we can do regarding them is to do our best to keep them from reoccurring in the future. Anyway, I haven't seen how your position does anything either to suddenly make all those things right. So I'm not sure why mine would have to.
Antinatalism doesn't justify those things because it recognizes that they were bad things and that ought not to have happened. Yet they all did happen nonetheless. Antinatalists recognize that any system that produces these wrongs as a natural byproduct must also be wrong and should not be allowed to continue. At least it actually puts an end to the recognized problem. Your method just keeps on sweeping it under the rug. As an analogy, if someone gets drunk and beats his wife, but then when he's sober, he recognizes that what he's done and says he'll never do it again. Then later, he goes out and gets drunk again, which leads to another beating. Then obviously, this man should stop drinking. If we see pain and death and anguish as bad things, then we have to stop generating more creatures that will experience and cause these things to continue to happen. Even if we somehow removed all the bad things 100 years in the future, that still doesn't give us good reason to keep beating your wife here in the present. Also, in your ideal utopia where no one dies, a good percentage of the people in society will want to not have been brought into existence. If you're now forced to live forever, what kind of sadistic trick is that to play on them?
If they no longer wanted to live in that ideal society, couldn't they just commit suicide?
No, John. There is a difference between wanting to have never been born and wanting to die. Every person is born with an automatic apprehension towards death. It's not just people being happy with their lives, it's the people that hate their lives too.
His gaze darkens.
Every day you're forced to undergo a process that you dislike, that you hate. Everything you do has no meaning to it and will make no difference 20 years from now. You are a tiny blip of insignificance along with everything else that you do. Suicide seems like an ideal option, but in order to do that, you have to first lose your built-in fear of death, of the unknown, which has been biologically hard-coded into your every living cell. What could be worse than not wanting to live, John? At the very same time being too afraid to ever die. The people that do commit suicide generally would prefer to have been able to live a long and good life, but they recognize that life that they'd be likely to live is unattainable, making it better for them to not undergo the upcoming stress and suffering that they would experience if they stayed alive. Nobody kills themselves because they want to die. They kill themselves because they don't want to continue living. I have been bred against my will to not want to die, and every experience I have had has led to me not wanting to live. I am trapped within the paradoxical absurd. I don't blame my parents. They didn't know what they were doing. But you all, now every single one of you listening is culpable.
He rests his head in his hand.
It'd be better if I could just find peace about death, but even then, the thought of it haunts me to no end. I can't sleep. I am in literal hell. I am only trying to keep others from making the same mistake that my parents did. I've realized that this existence is not a good one since I was 8 years old. We are subjecting innocent children to go through pain and suffering, and just by their nature, they will inevitably cause pain and suffering onto others. The only people that can ever be innocent from the necessary evils in life are those that do not exist. And that is the only ideal that we can ever hope to accomplish. if we could only just accept it.
Each of them, except for Bradley, looks down at the floor. God/evil. There is silence. Lindsay? Katie? Is she muted?
SJ, your turn.
Sorry. I'm
That's
here,
right.
sorry. You know, I used to have some of these types of thoughts like yours when I was younger. Thankfully, I got put on some medications about 10 years back, and I've been doing pretty good ever since. There's a lot to our biology, how our biology affects our mood, as well as thinking about how that affects our well-being. Have you tried taking anything for your this?
I'm not making my case because of any type of mental illness, Lindsay. It's a philosophical position, not a psychological one.
But, I mean, every person's philosophy is based on their psychology and personality.
It's quiet for a moment before Ellen manages to speak up.
I sometimes get into a dark place like you as well, Samuel. Even being a Christian, it gets hard. I question my faith in God a lot more than I'd like to admit, or I would if I ever allowed myself to deeply consider it. See, I work as a nurse, so I've seen all the bad things that you mentioned here, and much worse. But I've also seen how the suffering of those in great pain were comforted by their belief in Jesus. That was actually what brought me back to God originally. I was amazed at the resilience a relationship with Jesus gave to some of the patients there. And then I decided to start praying with the people that are dying, to give them a chance to be comforted in their last moments. Maybe accept Jesus and go to heaven, free from the suffering and heartache of this world. But there's always just too many of them. I don't have the time to talk. I just do all I can to try to keep them alive. And I even fail at that. I used to do silent prayers for them while working, but lately I've just been putting it off. Now I just try to focus on the job and ignore the fact that most everyone around me is slowly dying. My husband and I have wanted kids for years now. While we were dating, we agreed on having 5. And then after we got married and tried and prayed, it turns out that I'm not able to. I used to ask God for a miracle every night before bed, that in return I would do my best to save as many lives as I could at the hospital, in exchange for just one of my own. I know that's not how miracles are supposed to work, but I did it anyways. I thought that maybe God was punishing me for something I might have done while I was younger and had maybe forgotten about. I've begged for forgiveness, but I still get no response from him. So that's what lately turned me away from him. I've stayed in the church, done all the rituals, but my heart's not been in it. I'm an ardent Christian to everyone I interact with, but when alone, I'm essentially just another atheist like yourself. People need a savior from the suffering of this world. Maybe the removal of hope from people's lives just makes the suffering worse.
She wipes her eyes.
You're right that it's wishful thinking. God might not exist. The world probably makes a lot more sense if he didn't, but I don't want to give up hope. Maybe this is just somehow part of his plan.
She looks down, shaking her head.
No, that's just the usual BS we Christians used. If this was part of God's plan, then he would be cruel. And if he was cruel, then we have nothing. My only hope is that the pain we see in this world is all part of our own doing and will all be made right in the end. That's my declaration of faith. Here's my predicament. Perhaps you all can empathize. Either there is a God and we are his subjects, or there is no God, no arbiter of wisdom, meaning, morality, and value. And so we are all left with ourselves as the only gods that we'll ever have. But I can't help but see the evil within mankind and myself. And so I can only reject us being gods and instead accept there must be a God I've been brought up in. If God did not exist, I feel like it might be necessary to keep on pretending he's there, just so that the world and our values and morality can all make sense again. For a world without God is a meaningless one not worth suffering through.
She cries into her hands.
Why did you bring me here? It seems like some cruel joke to play on someone who all her life has wanted children, but can't, who can hardly see herself as a woman at all. And then you have her listen to your talk on why having children is wrong. Why do you do this to me? Can I not just live with my small amount of false hope to keep me going? Why can't I just believe in miracles? I'm not going to have children. I know that. Okay, there. Are you happy, God? Why? Why? Is it because I doubted? Is it your strange attempt to comfort me in my failures? To tell me how my lifelong dream was actually morally wrong for me to want? Is this just even more punishment for me? I just wanted to be good, God. I just wanted to be good.
She covers her face and cries. After she composes herself somewhat, Samuel responds.
I'm sorry, Alan. I didn't know any personal information about any of you. I just picked a bunch of people within the likely age range of not having kids yet at random and sent out the invites.
Ellen nods, sniffling. Bradley stands up without much consideration.
Here's where you're wrong, not Bradley, Samuel. Your rationale for measuring that life itself should not exist can only occur from within the very frame of life that you yourself are arguing against. You're unknowingly rebutting your own point by assuming that your ability to make evaluative judgments is a positive property compared to the not existent ones who do not have that ability. If it's better to know what's good and bad compared to being non-cognizant of this distinction, then life is better than death.
How many times do I have to say this? That is not my argument. I have never said that death is better than life, only that for the person to have could potentially come to exist, it would be better for them not to come to exist. I could place an infinite stock of value for continuing to exist for all those that are already alive, while remaining entirely consistent with my position of antinatalism. Any new life that would experience inevitable suffering during it is one that it would have been better if they had not had.
Ah, of course. Suffering, that great evil. Evil is just an overstepping of one's own moral assumptions onto those that don't share in them. For the great moralizers to say, we should stop all the things that I happen to be unable to stomach from ever happening, even by those that would be able to stomach them. This is the most narcissistic move I have ever seen, and I will not tolerate it. This is why Nietzsche said that man was a thing that would need to be overcome. We have need to become gods. We need to have the bravery to call whatever it is that we will to be good simply because we will for it, unrequiring of any justification for it external to itself.
Ellen stands.
How can you say that? Why are you lying to yourself, Bradley? You are not God. None of us are. Evil obviously exists. It's within all of us. We can't just decide what's right and wrong at will. We all know what is and isn't evil. It's not some great mystery. That's how we know that morality is something outside ourselves, because we are unable to willfully change what we experience as being evil. A child molester. There's someone who is undoubtedly evil.
I'm trying to help you out here, Ellen. By creating a moral framework, a system of oughts and ought nots, we idolize a singular ideal or principle over God. It's placing ourselves above God by saying that there were certain things that he has created that you disagree with him on. Morality is not actually a part of nature, Ellen. By accepting the idea of morality, you thereby reject God. Thus entails the problem of Greek monotheism. By having an external God, you produce a dichotomy. If God is the only one who is good, as Plato says, then all else that is not good is not good. Is not God is not good. It is instead evil. All else besides God should not be. But if instead God is the entire universe and all us within it, then there is nothing that we could call not God or not good. That's why I'm a modist. There are no actions, no choice, no sin, no individuals, no differences, no good or evil. All simply is.
Sin isn't an invention created by the Christians, Bradley. It's a problem that has been with us ever since Adam, something we needed a solution for, and found it with Christ. If God is not all good, then I would reject him, and I cannot accept that. If God does not exist, and all actions we might see as evil are simply misapprehensions on our part, then I also cannot accept that, because we cannot help but recognize the evil within our own hearts and in the hearts of others, and we need a savior, the perfect one by which all good comes. And if there is none, that means that Samuel would be correct.
Bradley opens his mouth to respond, then sits down silently. He changes his mind and stands up again.
What you call sin, though, is an eternal component to existence that you must always accept in life. If you cannot tolerate sin, you cannot tolerate life, and will seek out its demise, just like Sammy here. Christians haven't dealt with sin. They've only managed to be better at hiding it than others. Every pious act is paid for with sins. Piety is where people signal their virtue to relieve themselves from guilt. To live without sin is to place the burden of a sinful act forwards into the future for others to have to deal with. A war crime, perhaps, or maybe a couple bombs dropped onto civilians.
Bradley, didn't I ask you to keep quiet? Alias, you have a question directed towards me.
Crime/punishment. John raises his hand and stands.
Yes, Samuel. I have a question regarding Alan's point. What about child molesters? What should be done to them?
Obviously, they should be criminally charged and kept from ever doing it again.
Should they each be kept in a cushy cell, live out the rest of their life rent-free, apart from others, living in a quiet life in prison to themselves? Or should they be punished? What is the appropriate punishment for child rapists? The infliction of torture, undesired death, removal of autonomy? Is people's well-being only worth considering when they are what we call good people?
I don't understand what you're getting at here.
With your negative utilitarian ethic of mitigating suffering for all conscious creatures, does it mean that people such as pedophiles should not be punished for their crimes? Just kept away instead, scrounging off society's tax dollars, but still being given the tools necessary to maximize their well-being?
Samuel is quiet, thinking.
Here's the question, one that we can use your objective morality on. Which is more wrong? To kill an innocent baby painlessly in its sleep, or to cut off a pedophile's penis with as much pain inflicted as possible?
Samuel becomes frustrated.
I'm not going to answer that.
Why not? You have an objective morality. Surely we can measure which action causes more suffering, and by your definition, which action then would be more incorrect?
After a moment, Samuel responds.
Well, considering the suffering of the baby's parents...
Both the parents are fine with it. Prefer it, in fact.
Samuel crosses his arms with a grimace and glares up at the ceiling, not speaking.
Which is worse, Samuel? Painless infanticide or the torture of a pedophile?
Neither of those are the topic of today. I am primarily focused on the act of childbirth itself. That is the only position that I am arguing against. I cannot adequately judge between those two sins. I do not have all the circumstances behind the situation.
But surely your moral system could be used to determine which action is more wrong than the other, right? I thought you said that your system didn't require particular circumstances, but operated from simple abstractions, like a math problem. I suspect you're silent because I've pointed out the problem with your philosophy. It only ever uses a singular axis for decision-making, which is suffering. However, there are decisions that need to be made that have no relation to that, such as, should I eat sugary foods? From a singular axis of suffering, the answer would be sure. Antinatalism is way too simple. It has no positive reason to do anything at all, only negative reasons to avoid certain things. So morality only built upon thou shalt not have children. But since I'm already alive, I need something more than that to create a positive lifestyle for myself, which, from the antinatalist perspective, would be considered an oxymoron, since no life to them is worth living. So I'll ask again, which is worse, Samuel, torture or infanticide?
Samuel shakes his head.
This is an irrelevant short experiment.
Stop being so furtive. Just admit that there's a difference between punishing an innocent party and a guilty one. Justice doesn't even exist in your framework. Just the collective feelings of the crowd, some sort of mob rule. But justice demands that the malevolent suffer for their actions because they willingly ignored or rebelled against reality. So I'm asking you again, which is worse?
Both acts are wrong, okay? But in certain bad situations, there's the necessity to do bad things, which is more in line with my case because I admit that these are situations should not be allowed to occur. Good is something that can never be attainable by your limited nature. One person's good is always coming at the cost of someone else's. It's impossible for all benefits to benefit at the same time. However, it is possible for all to remain in suffering. In any circumstance where the parents did not want and so abandoned the child, no one was there to take care of it. I can see the merciful act to be painless and end to be a painless end for that child. Certainly, the child would have had certain biological proto-interests for survival that sadly could not be met by society, and so, well...
He trails off.
Now, as for the guilty party, which is really a misnomer since they are only an unfortunate byproduct to their environment and history, they sadly had no part to play in their crimes any more than you had a part to play in your eye color or sexual preference. So the proper course of action is to keep the criminal away from society, both for the protection of the children as well as to serve as an example to mitigate others from committing similar acts. We also do our best to try to rehabilitate that person so that they could be safely reintegrated in society at some point in the future.
Bradley stands up.
What I don't see is how you can say that from within your framework that molestation is wrong if it might happen to be pleasurable to the participants in the moment. If what is to be considered wrong is whatever causes subjective suffering, wouldn't instead the later feelings, guilt imposed by the society be what's considered wrong then? Shouldn't the normalization of pedophilia be the most utilitarian of the actions because it benefits both parties' subjective well-being rather than the asymmetry in favor of the child? Surely in a society in which the molester marries the child and the child grows up to see this relationship as perfectly valid, then that would be one with much less displeasurable feelings to be had, and thus no moral burden of wrongdoing placed on the part of the molester, who had no choice in their sexual predilections.
What the fuck is wrong with you, Bradley?
I'm trying to understand the actual ramifications to the ways of thinking within your philosophy without trying to presuppose my own innate distastes that may have been indoctrinated into me. Exactly what you've been advocating here today.
No, none of what you've said necessarily follows from the logic of antinatalism.
Stop stalling, Samuel. You never answered my question. Which is worse?
I believe I have answered your question in a sophisticated and nuanced manner, fitting for such a complicated issue. I may not have answered the question in the way that you would have liked, but that is not the case. I'm sorry that your supposed gotcha moment has failed. I'll now ask you a question. Would it not have been better for both the child in the situation as well as for the pedophile if neither of them had come into existence? The child to be born into a family that did not want him, and the pedophile to be born with desires and urges that cannot be acted upon without serious repercussions, both mentally and socially against him, as well as the traumatization of his victims and entire life, along with whatever guilt or anguish that he himself might have for what he's done. Do you want people to be born into becoming pedophiles?
Well, I don't actually believe people's lives are dictated to them by the genetics and environment, because people have free will. We shouldn't disallow a child from coming into existence merely because we hypothesize that child will become a psychopath. That would be charging them for a crime that they haven't committed, which is unjust. Fate doesn't exist. People only turn into the creatures that they create through the choices and habits made in response to their environment in real time, not some backlog of processes since the start of the universe.
Irrelevant. Whether they committed a heinous act freely or not, the act of molestation would still be committed in this hypothetical scenario. Would it not be better if neither of those people had been created?
Fine, sure. Looking retroactively, I do think it would have been better if they had not been born. But do not think those specific cases can be generalized across the entire future population, because we can never have perfect knowledge of the future, simply our best bets. And since we don't want to create people that will be rejected by society, we should de-incentivize the structures that allow for child abandonment or pedophilia to take place the best we can.
Are you suggesting a eugenics program?
He smiles.
How very authoritarian of you.
No, I'm speaking culturally, voluntarily through society. Those not going to be able or willing to care for their children should have methods for preventing childbirth, either through contraceptives or by aborting the fetus.
But it's a human life.
John rolls his eyes.
Ellen, please.
John waves his hand.
No, it's fine. Let it go ahead.
Life/non-life. Ellen stands up unsuredly.
The reason it's wrong to kill a child isn't because of it has proto-interest in survival. It's because a child has a soul that is reflection within us of God, one with a purpose set out and designed for them, not to be tempered with by us. It's wrong to simply kill a baby because it's more convenient for the parents. I think I figured it out. The problem with having well-being as the focus of your morality is that it equivocates the desires of a person with what's best for them. But people can and regularly are wrong about what's best for them. And so the standard of morality must instead be based on something transcendent and objective, being who knows the best possible world and can direct us towards that world. And this being we call God. A rapist's desire to continue living or to rape certainly are his desires, but I see no reason at all why we should even allow for him to indulge in those desires, since we obviously aren't using his actual desires in that case to determine what's good. So then we also cannot do that for relying upon other people to determine the good. Not all motivations are noble and pure. We can recognize certain desires as either healthy or unhealthy, which means that what is good must be referring to something external to our own creations.
Have I ever said that we should be obeying all of our desires? It has never been part of my argument. I'm using a human ability to recognize that suffering is bad and that such suffering is inevitable to all lives. So life is bad, and it is wrong to create more of it. The pro-life position is absolutely delusional if taken to its logical conclusion. You're a nurse, right? You must be aware of Tay-Sachs disease, an incurable disease that affects children at the age of around 6 months, causing the child to be unable to turn over, crawl, or move at all. The baby has seizures, and suffocates in the crib when left unattended. They become more and more decrepit, until ultimately dying at around age 5. There's nothing that can be done. However, the genetic markers can be stopped in the parents through blood tests or in the...
Just retake the one.
However, there's nothing that can be done. However, the genetic markers can be spotted in the parents through blood tests or in the child by the 11th week of development. I cannot accept that any sadistic pro-lifer would advocate for that pregnancy to be carried out to its full term. If they did, they should be criminally charged. The difference between a child with Tay-Sachs and anyone else that is born is simply a difference in degree, not of any difference in kind. All will have to face suffering, and all will have to face untimely deaths.
After a moment, Lindsay gingerly speaks up.
This distinction you make between new life and old life, or existence and non-existence, is one that I don't think is such an easy dichotomy to accept. If there was no continuity between who I was 5 years ago and who I am today, then antinatalism would be correct. But there is a continuity, and this continuity cannot be materially based. Just as nearly every atom in our bodies are replaced every 5 years and must instead be spiritually based. So, because consciousness cannot be explained via reductionism, this means that consciousness cannot be reduced, and it is singular binding principle to the entire universe. Every child that will come into existence already does exist within the eggs of the mother, or in the matter that will make up the precise sperm that will fertilize that egg. everything that used to exist still does. And all that will come to exist is already here as a part of the eternal Tao. The entire universe itself is a living, breathing entity. We just participate within it, like honeybees within a colony.
Samuel shrugs.
Okay, sure. But my argument doesn't rely on philosophical naturalism having to be true at all. Even if we did have immaterial souls or were simply components to the consciousness of the universe at large, our morality would still be based off the experience or well-being of for any and all conscious entities capable of being harmed or benefited, either within bodily form or outside of it. If the entire universe is experiencing or pain through us and our actions, as you might say, then we must prevent that pain from occurring further, wherever it might happen in the cosmos or in the spirit realm.
John shakes his head in his seat.
This is just ridiculous. Why are you even humoring her if you don't believe any of this junk?
Because I'm trying to make my points clear to all of you from within your own worldviews. Just like how I wouldn't be able to speak English to you all if you only spoke Japanese. If I was exclusively presenting my case from my own worldview, then you all would simply dismiss me for not aligning with your own ways of looking at things.
But we, who actually hold these worldviews, are not antinatalists. You're just twisting the arguments around so that you can make them reach your nihilistic conclusion. Not being honest nor rational. You're merely employing post hoc rationalization to try and trick us into agreeing with you.
I'm using rationality, John, to follow the arguments along their logical conclusion. Just because the conclusion doesn't fit to your preferences, that doesn't mean that I'm incorrect in my analysis. Although I'm welcome for any rebuttals. If a position we hold turns out to be based upon false assumptions that cannot be rationally justified, then that position can and should be dismissed.
Thomas stands up.
But that very maxim can't even withstand its own scrutiny, as it rests upon plenty of implicit assumptions that cannot be rationally justified, such as the universe we exist within is fully comprehensible to ourselves, that our values must be built up from objectively real things instead of simply our preferences, and that people's values can be changed through rational argumentation. And it also rests upon the myth that people are rational creatures altogether, which seems to be a regular misconception made by those that never actually interact with people. If we were purely rational creatures, I don't think we'd recognize ourselves.
Are you honestly trying to make a rational argument against the utility of rational argumentation? That is hilarious, Thomas. It seems like I am the only one here that is even trying to remain even internally consistent with their own worldview.
Thomas thinks. Truth/well-being. He then looks up slowly.
But why ought we be internally consistent? That just seems to be relying upon a different moral framework than your utilitarianism. You're saying we ought to be internally consistent, as if there is some sort of logical, moral reality we ought to be beholden to. But for what reason ought I to obey the truth rather than a lie that serves my needs better? Why should I follow whatever path truth supposedly leads me down if I'd rather not accept the conclusion, or if it psychologically harms me to do so? Your methodology of morality gives us Your methodology of morality gives us no basis for requiring logical consistency. Truly fully fledged utilitarians would, and I suppose should, only accept premises and conclusions that provide them with a greater level of well-being than the alternative, right? Suppose being an antinatalist caused me to have 5 units of suffering, but my having a child, our family of 3, only have 1 unit of such suffering each, meaning that natalism would provide a lesser degree of suffering than antinatalism. So here's my question for you, Samuel. Is a lie that eases suffering and promotes well-being something that we should to spread?
You're just making up statistics. You have no proof that antinatalism causes more suffering. And besides, one can gain all the benefits of a typical natalism by just having a vasectomy and adopting children. And as for your question, I should point out that I'm primarily a negative utilitarian, only secondarily as positive utilitarian. Meaning that, while some utilitarians would have issues with weighing the promotion of well-being against the mitigation of suffering, I first analyze whether an act will cause any suffering, then, if not, whether it promotes well-being. That way, we aren't beholden to the absurd implications, the various thought experiments of the utility monster or the AI that is programmed to experience near infinite levels of well-being whenever others experience suffering. This also provides justification for why the fictional city of Amelis would be immoral. The pleasure gained from a city of people cannot be brought through the immense pain of the individual, no matter how many Christians might believe otherwise. So no, self-delusionary lies are always more detrimental to time, and thus should be rejected. Any avoidance of truth will only postpone the more painful epiphany of reality breaking through. Truth always beats lies in the end.
How do you know that? It seems like just a hopeful assertion that you need to make to support your position. You can never really know that truth will always win out in the end against lies. In fact, as you've been saying before, our long-standing, evolved intuitions to procreate have theoretically been lying to us over these millions of years and telling us that it's what we should do. Why would you think that truth is suddenly going to win out against lies if it goes against the trajectory of all history thus far? Take, for example, our religious beliefs. If they had some sort of evolutionary advantage to them, then we'd all be the byproduct of lies succeeding more than truth, running completely contrary to your claim that truth wins out in the end.
Right. See, I'm not speaking revolutionarily here, or even regarding human motivation. Just that truth has an explanatory and predictive power that falsehoods do not. So within that domain, truth always wins out.
So do you think that the laws of logic are created by us or discovered?
I think they're discovered, but not in the way that you might imagine. Logic isn't some sort of supernatural property to the universe, but is more likely how a chimpanzee will discover the utility to a stick for catching termites. Humans just put things together and figured out that what works. The rules of logic are just methods we use in ascertaining the truth, in the same way that the scientific method is merely a set of practices for understanding the world as it is.
So I have no moral responsibility to obey the rules of logic or to accept their conclusions. You seem to be suggesting that we can behave both morally and rationally, but you haven't really proven that both of those are fully compatible with each other. Certainly, I can imagine a scenario where an irrational belief I had would be more practical in getting me to behave morally, such as the belief that God is watching my every move, or that I will burn in hell if I break certain social taboos, or by believing that every human I encounter is a manifestation of the Buddha within me. I can treat them with greater love and respect. It seems to me that, from a utilitarian's perspective, truth is only morally good to hold when and if it provides greater well-being to the listeners of it. If the belief in God, as well as structuralized religions, helped our ancestors be more moral than others, then do we have a moral obligation to believe untrue things that provide greater well-being for people? By using purely utilitarian ethics, logic itself becomes now reliant upon subjectivity, not upon rationality or truth, unless you consider there to be some other reason to obey logic besides your subjective pleasure/pain standards for evaluating. But that would run contrary to everything that you've been saying thus far.
Samuel's face falls in silent frustration.
No. The laws of logic aren't reliant upon our subjective experiences. You can't just escape from the logic of reality. As much as I might wish we could easily enter states of perfect bliss through deluding ourselves, we exist within reality and must work within the limitations we are given. Logic is the equivalent to reality for me. Here's a logical syllogism for you. If I place my hand on this hot stove, my hand will become burnt and I will experience pain. I experience pain as a negative. Thus, I do not want to experience bad feelings. I should avoid placing my hand on the stove. There you go. You can then use that personally discovered empirical data and extrapolate it outwards to other conscious creatures, both currently existing and potentially so, to inform of future actions and avoid causing suffering for ourselves and others. Because if there's anything that we can all agree on, it's that the worst possible suffering for everyone is bad. And if anything, everything could be called bad. That's definitely it.
Bradley butts in.
But why are we even bothering with extrapolating outwards onto others? Why ought we to try to reduce others' suffering in the world? Is it merely due to our own empathy? Then why not alternatively try to remove instead our own empathy rather than the world's suffering? Because while the latter is obviously unattainable, the former certainly is. Why are we even assuming that empathy is an asset to us rather than a flaw? Suppose it might instead be an indoctrinated tool of the herd morality, attempting to suppress my willpower and make me predictable and controllable. I reject empathy and her sister, liberalism, as mental illnesses, ones that are actively killing the white race.
Samuel shakes his head incredulously.
Whoa, Bradley, how are you real to ignore your racist remarks and answer your question? Do you do the extrapolation outwards because you're most likely not a solipsist, and so it's rational to assume other creatures like you are also capable of pain, just as you are?
Maybe I'll just become a solipsist then. Better than your specific brand of nihilism.
Samuel
Sure.
sighs.
Sure, you could believe in a lie, but putting trust into one that turns out to be false will only lead to loss and harm once you discover how you were incorrect.
Bradley shrugs.
Probably not.
And I'm not a nihilist. I believe that every action has the greatest of importance.
Thomas stands up again.
Wait a minute. If discovery of one's own incorrectness leads to loss and harm, then wouldn't it be wrong to tell the person that believes a lie what the truth actually is? Because if you do, aren't you then causing them harm?
No, because the truth is outside of morality, and they will discover it eventually anyways. Reality is neutral. The universe already exists, and life exists within it. In order to develop truth statements about the world, we must understand it as it is, not as we would like it to be.
So then, is the truth good? Is it intrinsically better to be able to recognize valid claims rather than invalid ones? If so, then it must be better to exist, for truth can only be seen by those that exist.
It's a faulty question. The truth merely is. It has no direct qualitative weight to it. It's not intrinsically good, just better for those that already exist to know reality, so that they can avoid being harmed by it.
Should we follow where the truth or laws of logic lead us? Seems like a moral question to me, especially if learning what the truth is could ultimately lead to suffering.
I'm not sure I'm following. Didn't I already answer that?
John speaks up.
I think I've got it. If your highest value is knowing truth, as mine is, then pain and pleasure are necessary tools for reaching accurate conclusions. However, if your highest value is well-being, then false truths that avoid pain or bring about pleasure are the only acceptable truths that you can allow within your philosophy.
Truth overall has no moral weight to it in my moral framework. It's simply the case that by using logic and knowing what's true, we can avoid causing more undue suffering in the world. That's what makes it ethical. Besides, in the long run, knowing true things leads more to well-being than false ones.
But that itself is a false belief. Pessimism seems to be quite prevalent in people that actually know what's going on. All too often, false beliefs provide greater well-being than true ones. Haven't you ever heard of placebos or of religion?
Jendrik?
Oh, that's not true. Religion has done a greater net harm to humanity, along with being entirely built upon lies. Sorry, Alan.
But according to your version of what is good, what makes it morally wrong to lie about past events? Why would Joseph Smith be morally wrong because his visions caused a new, tightly knit religious community to form, which led to higher amounts of well-being for those people? According to your principles, what makes a charlatan morally wrong for lying to his customers? In fact, as your ultimate goal is for humanity's extinction, does that mean that Anne Lee, the leader of the celibate Shakers movement in Protestant Christianity, is she more moral than you because she successfully spread false beliefs that lead to fewer people being created?
I'm unfamiliar with her, so I can't say.
Well, then take it as a hypothetical. Say someone lied about getting a vision from God, telling them to prophesy to the people, telling them that procreation is a sin and God is angered by unprotected sex. Suppose he managed to convert every single Christian in the United States to the point that the population decreased by half. And since studies show that people living within tightly knit social communities, namely religious, have a much greater deal of self-reported well-being than others, is he a better person than you for doing this?
First of all, I do not categorize people according to some moral weight, for it inevitably leads to atrocities. But I would still disagree with his practices, because were it to ever come out that his vision was a lie, then all his preaching would be naught for naught, and people would return to procreation just like that. That's why truth is better than falsehoods. It can withstand scrutiny. Since I'm making my case entirely from a rational and truthful basis, there aren't any true arguments that can turn people away unless they know something I don't. As far as I'm aware, all my arguments are valid and sound. Who misses out by not existing? No one. Who suffers from existing? Everyone, in some fashion or another. Who benefits from existing? Not everyone, as shown by suicides and depression. Antinatalism is the only position out there that deals with all of these facts properly.
They're all silent. Procreation/adoption.
Suppose I agree with you on maximizing well-being and mitigating harm, but it doesn't harm me at all to be internally inconsistent with my use of logic. For you say we should accept the logical conclusions to arguments, both in physical form, as in the case of the hot stove, as well as spoken arguments that are rationally sound. But there seems to be a huge difference between the two. Your reason for accepting the physical example is because of the avoidance of pain. But that's not why you say we should accept the second. You say we should accept it because it's true, as if I'm only allowed to believe true things. But who's going to stop me if I don't? In fact, I believe if I were to accept your pessimistic philosophical position, it would actually worsen my well-being. So to use your hot stove analogy, it's better for me to not accept antinatalism because I avoid the suffering I'd have from holding such an ideology. Sorry to repeat myself, but if our moral actions are only in regards to avoiding suffering and providing well-being, then there's nothing within that moral framework that tells me that internal consistency is a desirable aspect for all my actions, just so long as they do not bring about suffering. Your argument is self-refuting, and so I reject antinatalism.
The acceptance of moral implications behind childbirth is irrelevant to your psychological well-being. You could still be a perfectly content and live out a fully self-actualized life without even ever having to procreate. And even if you did need some sort of familial connection, you could still certainly just adopt a child.
There's no way in hell an adoption agency would let an antinatalist adopt. Children's psychology are so vulnerable as it is. Please do not raise kids to have such a depressing outlook on life.
Samuel's offended.
Being an antinatalist would in no way affect my ability to properly care for a child.
Are you sure about that? What about when your kid experiences his pet die?
I don't believe it's ethical to enslave animals.
Thomas rolls his eyes.
Fine. What would you do when your child experiences the death of his grandparents? What philosophical wisdom can you give to help them cope with the arbitrariness and painfulness of life?
So you agree with me?
Sure, life is painful and suffering is arbitrary, but your conclusion isn't helpful for coping with it and living out a good life anyways, especially not for children.
I'm sure children can understand the simple principles of and rationality behind the ethics and of antinatalism. I certainly did.
Yeah, but how is that going to fuck up their psyche by being raised by a parent that wishes no one was ever born?
Samuel thinks it over.
Perhaps you're right, but that still doesn't change my full position at all. Just that perhaps antinatalists might not be the best people for raising children. I'd need to see some data on it, but I can at least consider that possibly being true.
Lindsay stands up.
You're still focusing entirely on the negatives in life, what to avoid. It's a toxic attitude to take. You're completely ignoring what we're supposed to be moving towards. So here's my own attempt at an argument. It's good to cause pleasure in others, so to bring people into existence, to experience pleasure is also good to do.
While that certainly sounds nice, we must first understand what is meant by it is good. Good for whom? Yourself or for the unborn? One person's good always comes at the negative cost to someone or something else. So there is no such thing as a good in itself. However, there is such a thing as bad for everyone. So there's an asymmetry there. If something's good for yourself, then your pleasureful gain comes at the expense of the inevitable increase in suffering that will be created along with the child. You gain pleasure from an innocent party's suffering is sadism and selfish, egoistic evil. If it's instead for the good of the unborn, then its outcomes must be weighed against its current position or non-position. To come to exist is to be put into a constant state of deprivation for the necessary materials for continuing to exist, requiring constant exertion from yourself to remain in a base neutral state, where you have to take from the weaker than yourself to survive. Essentially, by existing, you must work in order to stay alive, and even then, you will ultimately fail to do so.
Wait a minute. In your earlier example of avoiding sickness through vaccines, you said that the avoidance of pain was a positive, even if no one benefits from it. But that contradicts where you've said the positive notions can only be derived from and for creatures that already exist. What gives?
Right, I can see the confusion. The positiveness to avoiding pain can be thought of in two ways. One, as an abstraction rather than an actually experienced emotion for the non-existent subject, or two, as a positive emotional experience in relief from guilt for those who do exist that know that they will not cause an innocent child to have to undergo suffering from their own actions. As I've already laid out in my asymmetry argument, I see it as much worse for a life to come to exist, which will only experience suffering, as I brought up in my example of Tay-Sachs disease in babies, more so than it could ever be considered better for a life to come to exist, which will only experience joy. It's better to avoid the former than it is to miss out on the latter.
He takes a drink from his bottle and looks around. Hell/suffering.
Do any of you have any other arguments against my case?
He shrugs.
Are any of you convinced at all yet?
Bradley laughs.
Oh my god. You actually think this is real? You're just a monkey making noises with your mouth at us, Samuel. Your words aren't real in the same way that a steak or my fist is real. Words do not change things. You're very amusing to listen to, though. I'll give you that.
Thank you. And irrelevant as always, Bradley.
See, here's the thing. Pragmatically, your position might actually be counterintuitive to your cause, because only the people that are more interested in behaving morally might be persuaded by your arguments to not actually have children. Yet while the people that are more immoral, by your standard, that are not likely to be motivated by your words will continue to have kids. So the antinatalists might be doing a greater disservice to humanity by allowing the world to become inherited by those that don't care much for the well-being of others, thereby making empathy actually a maladaptive trait to the human species, so that it be bred out of existence with time.
So what you're doing is presenting the pragmatic argument against antinatalism, which I should point out accepts all the premises and conclusions to antinatalism and is only tackling the implementation method. Now, I do think that this philosophy could grow to become widely accepted as an ethical principle that would be socially enforced and, if necessary, governmentally regulated. Something perhaps akin to China's one-child policy from back in the 80s. A no-child policy, aside from adoptions. So, while your point is understood, it would only be a later concern, and the only one that still has potential solutions for it.
After a moment of silence, Ellen speaks up again.
I just want to know, Samuel, what would you consider a good life to be? What would a life that was worth living look like to you?
I do not think one is even possible, but if it were, it'd be free from the experiencing of or the causing of harm. I'll raise a thought experiment for you now. What if I went around injecting a mutated brain cancer into children that causes them to be in a state of bliss and happiness, but kills them in 5 years? They'd be unaware of their inevitable deaths, or they are blind to any suffering or harm that they might cause for other people. Would it be wrong for me to do this? I'm sure you'd say yes, but what if we are already doing this every time we have children? And what's even more frightful is that what we are doing is more benign, because instead of committing a child to complete bliss and happiness for 5 years, we are committing them to decades upon decades of recurring pain, ailments, unfulfilled desires, heartache, guilt, and loss.
Well, I'd have to bring back my argument from earlier. If it is, as you say, that the world is evil, how did you evolve a moral sense that deciphers this as being wrong, instead of just seeing it as an undesirable commonplace part of reality? Why should what we see as wrong be stopped, instead of just avoiding it?
We've already gone over this, Alan. I also didn't evolve the ability to run calculus. This is just a culturally learned addition to my biologically evolved mechanisms. The conclusion just logically follows from the already understood premises. Seriously, why is it so hard for all of you to get this? None of you have refuted any of my arguments. Why do you think life should continue with all the suffering within it? Are you all so enclosed within your tiny social bubbles that you just don't realize how shitty life actually is for most people? Take some time to observe the world around you for once. If you truly loved your children, then you wouldn't create them to undergo a life full of suffering.
It's not all that bad, man. It only looks bad if you have an irrational expectation that it should instead be better. If you expect the worst instead of wishing for the best, you'll be happily surprised by the results. The universe exists. We exist within it and desire to continue existing in it. Therefore, we should do so.
That's a surprising word usage of we there, coming from an individualist such as yourself. Surely you're not collectively including potential people that do not yet exist that we, right? Wouldn't that be acting for others? I thought that was a no-no for objectivists. Also, you're committing the naturalistic fallacy. Just because the universe exists doesn't mean that such existence is good. Unless, of course, you believe in an omniscient, omnibenevolent deity that created and sustains the universe. But we've already gone down that topic, so let me get this straight. you said that the people that are suffering are only doing so because they have an irrational expectation that their lives should be better for some reason. So you're saying that those that are living in a drought, dying of thirst, they should just stop whining about having no food or water, and they should just lower their expectations and just live within their misery, or rather die in it? But no, not before having children, of course. Whatever it takes to continue the cycle of suffering forever. Misery loves company, I guess.
I'm not saying that everyone should have children. With that caveat, I suppose that I can partially agree. In certain places, it would be much better for the people there in certain places it would be much better for the people there if they didn't actually have kids, if they wouldn't be able to support them.
Why there, but not here?
Because here, we have the resources to sustain children without having to face a lot of suffering.
But they still are going to experience some form of suffering. Are you just making the case that the suffering Westerners go through is a better form of suffering than for people in third world countries? Because actually, there's really no difference in suicide rates between wealthy countries and poorer ones. So that would go against your thesis there.
Samuel shakes his head.
So no, nothing makes the forward continuation of consciousness worth the suffering, and it shall not be missed, either by the already dead or by the unborn.
This is so stupid.
You know what I think is stupid, Bradley? How about the needless deaths of children with excruciatingly painful diseases that they'd have to go through days and weeks only to still end up dying? Isn't that just stupid? So stupid that we all just continue to allow it to happen to them. It's just stupid.
So if there were absolutely no suffering, would existence still be evil to you? And if existence is evil and everything within it, then that'd mean that we are evil and all of our abilities to recognize evil would be evil too. But that's ridiculous. So I'd say that the capacity to recognize evil must itself be a good. Otherwise, you would advise that we all went onto narcotics just to ignore all the suffering in the world and heighten our well-being.
Are you even listening to me? I never said that the world or the universe is evil in itself. You're the one that keeps on trying to put those words into my mouth. I only said that it's worse, comparatively, to exist in a world than to not exist. And no, I don't think that ignorance is ever the proper response. However, from within your Christian worldview, it seems like it would be better to be naive of one's own wrongdoing than to be made aware of it. For God told Adam and Eve to not eat from the tree of knowledge to make them aware of their own iniquities. Also, Jesus said in Luke 12, to him who is given much, more shall be expected. And a slave knowingly goes against his master's will shall be whipped more than one who did not know. Now, maybe you disagree with God and Christ. That's up to you to figure out. All I'm saying is that you should not be allowed to force someone to go through suffering, no matter how much pleasure they might eventually get, if that person cannot consent beforehand, which the unborn children cannot do. So I ask you all, why? Why should we cause new people to undergo pain and suffering when it could have so easily been avoided with a single pill? Why should it even bother forcing more people into existence?
Because things are getting better, Samuel. There's a book called Better Angels of Our Nature, showing how, by almost every metric, life is improving.
That's inconsequential, since whatever good there might be to existing would only be for those that already exist. Also, is it really getting better? Suicides in Western countries are also on the rise. I wonder if that's mentioned in the book. I guess none of those who've recognized the meaninglessness to existence and ended their own lives have actually read this book. What a shame. Scientifically, we already know that the human race will eventually become extinct and that our solar system will cool and be inhospitable for all life. So why not put on a peaceful end to things sooner rather than later? better to stop it all instead of causing even more suffering to occur in the meantime. Will the superficial benefits gained from the Enlightenment ever becoming enough to justify the Holocaust happening? Or World War I? Bone cancer in children? Ebola? No, of course not.
But I don't need to justify any of that because I had no part in those atrocities. I can only be held accountable for my own actions.
Yes, but are you willing to condemn those atrocities through your actions in order to keep them from reoccurring?
Certainly. I condemn the arbitrators of the Holocaust. They were absolutely wrong for what they did.
Those are just words you're saying. By having children, you are complicit in any wrongful actions that might be done by your progenitors.
No, they would have their own moral agents. Whoops. No, they would be their own moral agents and are responsible only for themselves.
Except that their existence is contingent upon your actions here in the present. If you have kids, you're essentially saying that you hate your own child, or that you approve of every infliction of pain and suffering that came before you, as well as harm that will occur to them and through them within your bloodline. You validate the harm and approve the continuing of it. If you say with your words that it would be better if a pedophile were to never be born, and then go to take part in the creation of a pedophile, genetically speaking, even 3 generations past, you've breached your own moral code. You've taken part in the very end that you have statedly condemned. If evil at any point in time ever exists, then our universe ought not to exist.
What? Why?
Because our definition of evil is that which ought not to occur. So whatever system allows for evil to occur is proof of its immorality.
Except to steal from can't, ought implies can. Thus, if something which ought not occur does so, this is an indication that what did occur was not actually in the category of things we would be able to call evil. John's father died, and you might call that an evil. However, there are a multitude of worse scenarios of things that could have occurred instead, which are much worse, yet did not. Such as John's mother dying as well, or himself dying, or the entire world collapsing. The only indication we can have that those opposing realities should not have happened is that they did not happen. The reverse formulation also being true. Everything that does happen should have happened, because nothing could have happened other than it did, meaning that only one reality ought to have happened, and it is the reality we are within. The best possible world in comparison to all the impossible ones. This is our fate, and we should love it for being so.
No, just because something did occur does not make it morally permissible. That is certainly the naturalistic fallacy. And I'm not so sure I agree with Kant that ought does imply can. I agree that's how we commonly use it, but I am fairly sure that we do not have free will. It seems like a misuse of the word to think of ought in that fashion. When I use words like ought, I mean it as would be better if, and ought not as it would be worse if. Better and worse, of course, in respect to conscious creatures' collective well-being. But I think your reasoning is backwards anyways. If I'm understanding you correctly, you're saying that ought implies can, past events cannot be other than they are, therefore either all past events ought to have happened, or that moral oughts do not actually exist. But the flaw in your argument is presuming that oughts are in reference to past events. As far as I'm aware, how the term is commonly used is always in reference to future events that have not occurred yet. Because future events have not yet happened, they do still have the capacity to be enacted in certain ways over others. So moral oughts can still exist insofar we are only referring to future actions or past events that could have gone otherwise in some better fashion, yet did not.
You're still presuming we have the capacity to choose our future actions, but as you seemingly agreed with, free will is a myth.
I'm actually a compatibilist, so despite our values determining our choices, our own awareness is a component that plays a part in that active process.
Here's what I can't understand. How can you have any conception of value within your perspective? because an individual's well-being is a byproduct of procreation. You still call the preferences of a person good and to be valued, but the act that preceded it, you consider to be bad. If logical consistency is a goal from your version of objective morality, then experiences of well-being would be the product of evil then, and not worth morally considering, because their existence is profited off by all the pain and crime within history. Either that, or that any procreation that leads to the ability to experience well-being is a good act.
There's no logical inconsistency on my part in placing moral consideration even onto those that were produced through immoral means. Otherwise, if a conscious experience had to be produced through moral means in order to be morally considered, then that would mean that we'd have to kill off all babies produced through rape, which is generally not the position taken by most pro-life advocates. But if I'm properly understanding your argument, it would actually work more against your own position rather than mine, because through Adam, all that have inherited original sin, right? Doesn't that mean that all of Adam's children should not have been born?
Except that all can also be redeemed through the blood of the second Adam, Jesus Christ. Because God was incarnate, he gave us the pathway out of sin. And if Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless, and so is your faith. If God could not overcome death and sin and suffering, then antinatalism would be correct. But he did, so it isn't.
Unfortunately, Christ was just a man that fainted on the cross and woke up later. Or he was a Jewish heretic whose followers lied about his resurrection in order to overthrow a government.
Bradley speaks up.
Wrong. Christ was the God-man that managed to convince the West that suffering isn't an evil, but must be seen as a virtue. He made it so that death and suffering were no longer allowed to be considered as evils, because he sacralized those necessities of existence, making it so the future of the world could be built upon his own dying back that has been hung upon a cross.
Ellen is confused.
I'm not sure about all that, but I do think that suffering is one of the ways that God trains up his children in teaching us what we should avoid. Like how you might let a child to touch something hot so that they would know firsthand not to touch it again. We all sin and fall short of the glory of God, and the wages of sin is death.
See, that's where you lose me. The wages of sin is death argument only works for the perpetrator, not the victim that was harmed by the criminal's actions. Their suffering needs justification, and vengeance against the criminal doesn't do it. What are you saying that they get as penance for their suffering? Just to have learned what not to do? Do you think that the torture and genocide committed by the Nazis during World War II was worth it as some sort of sick training program given to God's chosen people?
Except we must remember that World War II is a product of man, not God. God allows evil to be committed by the Nazis, but this does not mean that it was his will that the Nazis did those things.
If it was not part of his will, then God is not all-powerful, for there was something going on against his will that he could have stopped, yet didn't.
Except that God wants that all people have the free will to either accept him or reject him. Along with that comes the ability for us to do evil.
Jendrik?
What?
Your line.
There is more text here.
What? Are you using an older just go into your to quote
all right, I don't
Albert.
even know. To quote Albert Camus, either we are not free and God, the all-powerful, is responsible for evil, or we are free and responsible, but God is not all-powerful.
Just because we have free will does not mean that there are things God cannot control. He's the one that gives us autonomy. The consequences of the choices that we make naturally follow. All of our actions will be repaid accordingly, either in this life or the next. Hitler shall and is serving his time in hell, and his victims have gained treasures for their suffering up in heaven.
Hold on a second. You're a Christian, though. Most of Hitler's victims were Jewish, so wouldn't they be serving their time in hell as well? Since surely none of them had accepted Christ.
God comes to each of us however he can, within whatever culture we're born into. God has mercy for those that have never heard of Jesus, but that still seek God and to do his will as best they can.
I seem to recall a passage that contradicts that. Something about Jesus being the only way to enter the kingdom.
John 14:6. Jesus said unto them, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes unto the Father but by me.
So those that did not accept Christ couldn't be with God in the afterlife and were instead most likely banished to hell, right there alongside Hitler.
I cannot say whom God does and doesn't have mercy upon. Personally, I think we tend to misunderstand what hell actually is. If life is eternal and cannot be ended through death, then hell is a place where souls go to escape the presence of God. As C.S. Lewis said, the gates of hell are locked from the inside. Which do you see as a worse fate, Samuel? For death to be the final end or for life to be eternal?
If either life includes any amount of suffering, then both are worse than to have never come into existence. And even if the gates of hell are locked from the inside, that does not absolve God's immorality for creating people capable and desirous of living in suffering. But I think perhaps even more importantly, Hitler actually had ties with the Christian church in Germany. What if there in his bunker he had with him a priest, and say that prior to committing suicide, he had a Paul in Damascus moment and saw the error of his ways and repented for his sins?
Except suicide itself is a sin.
Then suppose he had the priest absolve him during his dying breaths. If this had happened, would that mean Hitler was now in heaven?
How could I know that?
Isn't repentance the only thing necessary? Isn't that the reason for the crucifixion?
If Hitler really did have a change of heart, then yes, Jesus could have forgiven his sins. There have been those before, such as Paul, as you mentioned, who orchestrated the killings of Christians, who completely reversed his ways. Even those with irredeemable past can be forgiven by God's love and grace alone.
Then I want nothing to do with your Christian God. To absolve all the atrocities committed by us humans, along with giving us the freedom to continue doing them, is an even greater evil than creating us in the first place. If God could love and forgive someone that enjoys the harming of the innocent, then I would not want to love that God. I would highly suspect that the only reason that God could be able to do so was because he shared in his evil nature somehow. God has no right to forgive Hitler, since he was not the victim to Hitler's crimes.
Except he was. God was incarnate in flesh through Jesus Christ, who took upon himself the punishment for all sin, to make we who come into him clean through his sacrifice.
If he's God, then it can't really be considered a sacrifice, which I don't ethically agree with anyways. But even besides that, I don't believe that the willful death of some sinless Jewish doomsday prophet would be enough to make right all pain, suffering, and evil of the world, which, I'll add, is still occurring even now, 2,000 years after his death. So Jesus' death changed nothing. It did not and cannot justify the forgiveness of a child rapist or a murderer. That isn't justice. For the innocent party to take on a crime of the guilty, it isn't truth. To treat someone as if they'd never sinned, it's not right. That the guilty is free from retribution, and it's most certainly isn't God. Jesus Christ.
Retake that. Sorry.
What?
It isn't good. It's not. It doesn't say God there, and it most certainly isn't good.
It isn't good. Jesus Christ, if he did exist as put forward, would be the most immoral character in the entire Bible.
Ellen shakes her head in anguish.
So you demand justice for sins, but why should you want that from within your worldview, since Hitler has no choice in the matter and wasn't responsible for what he did? He was only deterministically driven to do what he thought was right from his perspective. And if there is no objective moral standard to compare his actions against, then Hitler was morally blameless for his actions.
Are you kidding me, Ellen? I do think that there is an objective right and wrong. I've been arguing for it this entire talk. I am not a moral relativist. The objective standard for measurement is suffering. Any act that causes unwanted suffering is a bad one. I can see that Hitler caused a great deal of suffering in his lifetime, but I do not think that for him to experience that same suffering multiplied back onto himself through hell would justify or somehow make right all the injury and harm that he had caused. And just to put a final pin in the concept of free will, Either man has free will and chooses the wrong intentionally, making us evil and unworthy of being continued, or man is not free, making God evil and his creation unworthy of being continued. Or neither God nor free will exists, making our moral expectations incompatible with our existence. And since we cannot rid of us of our consciousnesses, then we must instead be rid of our existence.
He checks his watch.
Alas, as we are just about out of time, I'm afraid that I still have not been given any sufficient defeaters to any of my main arguments. So just to go through them again, I have the argument from undesired death that goes as follows. 1. Undesirable states ought to be avoided, both for ourselves and others. 2. Death is an undesirable state. 3. Being alive inevitably results in death. Therefore, to be alive is an undesirable state and ought to be avoided.
He clicks on his laptop.
The argument from suffering as a negative, simply put, 1. A negative state's non-existence is better than its presence. 2. Suffering is an inevitable negative state only for those exist. 3. For those that do not exist, there is no presence of negative states. Therefore, it is better to not exist than to exist, for then there is no negative state or suffering to be had.
And he clicks again.
And the act from unnecessary harm of procreation. 1. It is wrong to unnecessarily harm someone. 2. Harm is the act of causing pain and suffering or death to be experienced. 3. Procreation is an unnecessary act which will inevitably cause the born to experience pain, suffering, and death. Therefore, procreation is wrong.
And he shuts his laptop.
Well, it has been 3 hours, and what all you all have done your part in hearing my presentation and participating. I have each of your payments for attending in these envelopes, as well as your cell phones here. If you'd like to speak more with me or get involved at all, I've put my cards into each of your envelopes.
He sets the 2 baskets at the edge of the stage.
I hope that you all will seriously consider the points I've made to you today. Please do not bring about more suffering into this world. Please do not have children. Thank you for your time.
The groups each slowly stand up and grab their phones, then slowly take their envelope as well. Ellen's last, but she only takes her phone.
Your payment, Ellen.
I don't want it. I'll keep you in my prayers, Samuel.
Samuel looks uncertain of how he's supposed to respond.
Thanks, Ellen. You have a good day.
Everyone now gone, Samuel starts to pack things up. The end. All right.
Yay.
Christ.
Oh man, good job, everybody. That was really good. Okay, so I'll in the stream in just a second. I want to put out there that this script and this whole experiment here is kind of like a first step in an active open collaboration regarding a lot of the topics and points and subjects brought up during the script. So what I'm really looking forward to is how people will respond from many of their like specific worldviews that they might align with some of the characters on here or against some of these things, and just to see how people might respond to a lot of the arguments kind of presented here, because I think there's a lot of intriguing cases made by each of the characters here, and I don't know where they are at fault. Hopefully people will be able to bring up and point out in order to defend their different positions that they have. So if either any of you guys in here or anybody listening, I'm putting it out there that I'm giving full access for people to either mirror this stream here or actually mirror the more clean and polished audio that I'll be putting out later on my YouTube channel. It's just John Buck, and it's only got one video on there right now, but I'll share it in my Twitter stream, which is @WriterJohnBuck. So when I do have that, it's up there that people can just listen to if they want to.
Nice. Well, thank you, John.
Yeah, and I want to thank all of you guys for participating, and also everyone that has been watching live in chat for all of us. Before we go, there is like kind of this, I don't know, like secondary scene that I'm not sure how well it really fits with the full script itself, and I don't know. People can take it or leave it as they wish. So
This is where I pull out the gun.
No. All right. It's
Samuel did really quite a role in this. Good job.
Yeah, good job, Jendrik. That was so good.
So I was able to do yoga stretches. Do stuff like that. Samuel wasn't able to do it.
I probably should have, considering how this was actually sort of exhausting.
Yeah.
And I don't know what will happen to my voice by tomorrow.
Yeah, you'd probably be like,
Too
all
funny.
right.
All right,
so,
guys.
yeah, well, hold on. Before we do, I want you and Lindsay to read your lines for the kind of like post-credit scene if you want to.
Yes.
Okay, so you guys have the script, so we'll just go ahead
Actually-
over that.
Oh, I didn't even shoot. I turned off my other computer. Let me, I'll read
Okay.
it from here.
Okay, from the stream.
Yeah, I'm reading it from the stream.
All right, I'll try to scroll a little bit ahead.
My
of
other
time so
computer's
that-
updating right now.
since there's a bit of a delay. Okay. Over Black, we hear Ellen getting her keys out. Lindsay approaches her.
Hey, sorry if this is overstepping, but have you and your husband ever considered adopting?
Well, unfortunately, my husband used to be a bad alcoholic, which has hurt our chances at that. Even if we could scrounge up enough to pay for it, we wouldn't be able to.
Well, have you considered using someone for a surrogate pregnancy? You see, I just found out yesterday that I'm late from a defunct relationship with an ex, and I've been on the fence, especially from this, in whether or not I should just have an abortion or not, just because I'm in no place to start a family myself. Anyways, do you think that you might?
Ellen starts to cry. The end.
Okay.
All right, yeah. So that's the I don't know, alternate ending, and I don't know.
I like that ending. I like that.
Yeah.
I like
I
that
don't
better.
know about that. It seems a little too much.
Right. Yeah.
I mean,
and that,
even for the types like Ellen and Lindsay,
yeah, that's true.
I don't think that's very realistic.
Yeah.
I like it. I was feeling so badly for me as Ellen.
Yeah. No, I think that's a nice ending for Ellen and Lindsay. That was sweet.
Yeah, it does have that bit of kitschiness to it, but yeah. Anyway,
Bits.
all right. Yeah. Thanks everybody. I'm going to let's see in the stream
All right,
now.
thank you.
Should we stop
Thank
on
you. It's
recording?
nice meeting